Chapter 458. The assistant minister of the Ministry of Rites, Chen Bo, stood out to make things difficult for Li Xianzi, which was not unexpected. As an important figure in Duke Chen's mansion and a staunch supporter of the King of Shu, Chen Bo could not convict Li Xianzi of beating up a prince, but he had to find a way to do something about it. However, they did not expect that he would choose to break through like this, which was really unexpected. Even if Li Xianzi really had great talent, he was too young. He was neither the Grand Tutor nor the Grand Tutor. Of course, he was not a famous Confucian scholar. However, it was indeed difficult for him to be the teacher of the princes at such a young age. Because many times, being young was a mistake. Oh, this is the imperial court. Assistant Minister Qin, you have to have evidence to speak. How can Li Xianzi's new mathematics be crooked? Suddenly, a voice came out of the silence, which attracted the attention of the people. Minister Qin. Seeing that figure, the officials were immediately filled with doubts. The first person to stand up for Li Xianzi was not Li Mingzi, the assistant minister of the Ministry of Personnel, nor Yan Bing, the minister of war, nor the old general who was very protective of him. It was Minister Qin of the Ministry of Revenue. Not only were the officials surprised, but Chen Bo also did not expect that the Minister of Revenue, who had never participated in the struggle in the imperial court, would suddenly intervene. Depressed, he said again, Minister Qin, whether my words have evidence or not, you only need to ask Minister Zheng of the Imperial College. Working in the imperial court, the most terrible thing was to be isolated and helpless. He had long expected that there would be opposition, and a few days ago, Chen Bo found himself a reliable ally. The Chancellor of the Imperial College was more qualified than him to speak on this matter in the entire imperial court. Hearing this, the officials could not help but secretly despise him. In the imperial court, everyone knew that the Chancellor of the Imperial College was a disciple of Prime Minister Qin and also a staunch supporter of the King of Shu. How could he stand up for Li Xianzi at this time? In that case, Minister Zheng, how crooked is Li Xianzi's new mathematics? At this time, Emperor Jing's voice came out. The Chancellor of the Directorate felt extremely bitter in his heart. If it were not for yesterday's incident, he would definitely stand on the side of Assistant Minister Chen Bo of the Ministry of Rites. But the problem was that the Directorate of the Directorate had a guilty conscience. The Emperor had already given them a chance yesterday. If they did not grasp it well, not only would he lose his position as Chancellor, but the entire Directorate of the Directorate would also be finished. Chen Bo, the Assistant Minister of Ministry of Rites, was originally smiling confidently. But as the Chancellor of the Imperial College spoke, his smile froze and his face gradually turned pale. He turned his head and looked at Chancellor Zheng, who was still speaking highly of Li Xianzi. His mind went blank. He did not understand. They had agreed that after he brought up this topic, Chancellor Zheng would stand up and denounce the new mathematics. At that time, there would be countless colleagues who would speak up and push this matter to the end. This was the first step to deal with Li Yi. Only after this step was taken could the subsequent plan be carried out. But, what was Chancellor Zheng putting on this show again? After Chancellor Zheng spoke, the officials were also stunned. Did Chancellor Zheng take the wrong medicine today? Why did he speak up for the county magistrate of Chang'an? Or did he have a grudge against Chen Bo? But weren't he and Assistant Minister Qin close to the King of Shu? Why would he embarrass Assistant Minister Qin in front of His Majesty and the officials? Among the officials, Qin Qing and Qin Chong frowned. This was because Chen Bo had not only lost his face, but also the face of the Qin family. What was wrong with Chancellor Zheng? Why did he suddenly change sides? In front of the officials, Prime Minister Qin was expressionless. It was impossible to tell whether he was happy or angry. However, many officials looked at the Chancellor of the Imperial College with slightly angry expressions. His performance today had completely exceeded their expectations. Minister Qin, do you have anything else to say? After the Chancellor of the Imperial College finished speaking, Emperor Jing looked at Chen Bo and asked again. I have nothing to say. Chen Bo's face turned green and white. He gritted his teeth and spoke. Not long after, the officials walked out of the hall one after another. Chancellor Jing stood in front and wanted to explain to Assistant Minister Chen. Unexpectedly, when Assistant Minister Chen walked past him, he only snorted coldly and strode away. He stood in the same place and his expression changed for a while. Finally, he flicked his sleeves and left. 10 more days. Li Yi counted the days with his fingers. He turned his head to look at Li Xian and said, "Why don't you go into the palace and tell His Majesty that Yongning's condition has just improved? The environment in the palace is harmful to her condition. Can she be taken out for treatment?" Li Xian rolled his eyes at him and said, "I am still grounded by Uncle Huang and can only stay in the Crown Prince's residence. How can I go into the palace to see him?" Li Yi shook his head. It seemed that he could not rely on this matter. However, he had waited for a year. A few more days did not matter. He lowered his head and continued to busy himself with the work at hand. Outside the courtyard, there was the sound of light footsteps approaching. "Martial uncle." Yang Liuqing stood at the door with a smile on his face. When Li Yi and Rui and Li Yi came to the capital from Qing and Prefecture, Yang Liuqing did not go with them. He stayed in Qing and Prefecture to help with the matters of the hero list. Mississippi Lu's female army also stayed there. This time, they came with Wan Ruoqing. Other than them, the real backbone of the brothel had completed the transfer from Qing and Prefecture to the capital. Old Sun, who was eager to develop, had long been impatient with them. Wan Ruoqing did not come to the Viscount's manor. Instead, she had Yang Liuqing bring a letter. "It's finally here." Li Yi finished reading her letter and put it back into the envelope. He raised his head to look at the distant sky and murmured in a low voice. "It's your luck to be able to enter the Qin manor. Keep your eyes open and work honestly. Don't look at things you shouldn't see and don't ask things you shouldn't ask. Otherwise, getting kicked out would be a light punishment. Do you all hear me?" In the Qin manor, a fat housekeeper stood with his hands on his hips. He pointed at the dozen or so new servants in the manor. "Yes." The servant said timidly. "Speak louder. Have you all not eaten?" The fat housekeeper asked with a frown. "Yes." "Qin Gui, what are you doing?" A voice came from behind. The fat housekeeper turned his head to look. In the next moment, a flattering smile appeared on his serious face. He said, "Fifth Master, the manor has been short on manpower recently. These are the new batch of servants we hired today." With that, he turned his head again. He looked at the group of servants and said, "Open your eyes wide and look carefully. This is the fifth master of the family. Quickly greet the fifth master." Hearing this, the new servants hurriedly bowed to the fifth master of the Qin manor. "Housekeeper Gui, where do you want to put these bags?" At this time, a figure with only half his head exposed walked over from behind. He carried several large bags on his shoulders and turned his head to ask the fat housekeeper. "Kitchen, kitchen. How many times do I have to say it? Put it in the kitchen." The fat housekeeper kicked the man's butt and said, "You only grow your body, but who knows where your brain has gone?" "Okay." The large man didn't get angry after being kicked. He responded and continued forward. "Wait a moment." The Qin clan's fifth master suddenly spoke. He looked at him and asked, "What is your name?" Replying to master, "This little one is Wu Er." The man replied with a simple and honest smile. The housekeeper called Qin Gui hastily said, "Fifth master, this is the distant nephew of old man Wu, who repairs the garden. He came to seek shelter with old man Wu. I saw that he had some strength, so I had him come to the manor to do some odd jobs to eat." The Qin clan's fifth master thought for a moment and said, I just happen to be lacking someone who can use strength. You can make the arrangements. Qin Gui was stunned for a moment, then he immediately nodded and said, Okay. Don't worry, fifth master. I will make the arrangements in a moment. Having said that, he kicked the man's butt and said, What are you waiting for? It is your good fortune that fifth master has taken a fancy to you. Hurry up and thank fifth master. The man gave a simple smile and promptly said, Thank you, fifth master. Thank you, fifth master. The Qin clan's fifth master waved his hand and turned to leave. The fat housekeeper looked at the man and smacked his lips. He said, Following fifth master is much better than doing odd jobs. Boy, you are really lucky. The other servants all looked at the large man with envious expressions. He had just entered the Qin manor and was already valued by an old master. His starting point was much higher than theirs. The man didn't seem to care about this. He carried the bags on his back and left with a simple smile. After walking 2 steps, he turned back and scratched his head with one hand. He asked, Housekeeper Gui, I forgot to ask. Where are these bags? Chapter 459. Young master, there are several people outside, saying that they are from the Imperial College. They want to see you. They have been waiting there for almost an hour. Fong leaned against the gate of the courtyard and looked inside. Imperial College. Li Yi did not raise his head. Wasn't the Imperial College a firm supporter of the King of Shu? Why did they come to see him? Did they bring any gifts? I don't think so. Fong thought for a moment, then shook his head and said. Then tell them that I'm not here. Let them go. Li Yi waved his hand impatiently. It was their first time to visit, and they did not even know the most basic etiquette. How could they be called Imperial College doctors? Where were all the books of sages and sages? Didn't the sages teach them to bring gifts when visiting others? Fong took the order and walked out of the gate. He said to the people beside the carriage, My young master is not here. You can leave. He's not here. The professors from the Imperial College looked at each other in dismay. Li Xianzi was grounded at home by His Majesty and could not go anywhere. Even if he wanted to brush them off, he should at least find a decent reason. People under the eaves had to lower their heads. No matter how angry they were, they still had to maintain etiquette. They cupped their hands and said, Please help us to inform him that the Imperial College Doctors of Arithmetic are here to learn new arithmetic from Li Xianzi by His Majesty's order. Do you guys not understand what I'm saying? Fong said impatiently, My young master said that he is not here. You'd better go back to where you came from. After saying that, Fong turned around and walked inside. He did not forget to remind the 2 guards at the gate, in the future, keep your eyes open. Don't just come in and inform anyone, especially those who don't bring gifts. Yes, Supervisor Fong. Fong was now the supervisor of the guards of the Viscount Mansion. Naturally, the 2 guards did not dare to have any objection. Supervisor Fong even dared to reprimand the Imperial College doctors. If they annoyed him, they would definitely suffer. Arrogant. He's too arrogant. A middle-aged man dressed in green had an ashen expression on his face. The directorate of the directorate and the doctor had personally come to visit a county magistrate, but they didn't even enter the main gate. What kind of contempt and humiliation was this? Forget it. Let's go back first. The leader, Yi, waved his hand and said helplessly. Given County Magistrate Li's temperament, today's cold reception was within his expectation. A few days ago in the Imperial Court, the Directorate of Imperial Academy had impeached County Magistrate Li a lot. Of course, it was impossible for County Magistrate Li to welcome him with a smile. However, he did not expect that the other party would be so resolute. The few of them did not even cross the threshold of the Viscount Mansion. In any case, they had to meet Li Xianzi. They couldn't guarantee that their brains wouldn't be intact if they made a mistake in the calculation next time. For the sake of his own head and for the future of the directorate, he had no choice but to swallow his anger. He could only prepare a generous gift the next day before paying a visit. Holding a big doll in her arms, Xiaohuan stood behind Li Yi and watched him busy. On such a hot day, she was unwilling to put down the doll sewn for her by the son-in-law. She held a small doll in her arms and a big one on the bed, which was stuffed with rags. It was very comfortable to sleep with it at night. She used to sleep with the first Mississippi. Later, with the son-in-law, she could only sleep alone. When it was cloudy and thundering, she would be too scared to sleep. These days, she slept much more peacefully with the doll in her arms. "Son-in-law, I've sent those people away." Fong came in from outside again and said, "I think they will come again. What if they bring gifts next time? Then leave the gifts and send them away." Li Yi was thinking about whether the bow on the sheep's horns was on the left or the right, so he said casually, "Oh." Lao Fong nodded and said, "If there's nothing else, I'll go to old Sun's place to help him. If you need anything, send someone to call me at the brothel in the city." Li Yi waved his hand and said, "Go. There's nothing here. Remember to take a bath when you come back. There's no smell of perfume in the brothel." After a while, Fong went out of the mansion with a smile on his face. He had to go to the brothel. Otherwise, it would be hard to explain to his wife at home. If there was a chance, he would help the second miss and find a few top martial arts masters to fight. At that time, he would have something to boast about to Xiaohong. Is it left or right? If it's only one side, it's not symmetrical. Will it look a little uncomfortable? Looking at the son-in-law who began to talk to himself again, the little maid was a little worried. The son-in-law seemed to be a little strange these days. Did they really say so? In the hall of diligent government, Emperor Jing frowned and asked, "I haven't had time to submit the memorial of the envoy of the Qi kingdom to your majesty." An old man dressed in green said, "These days, they have even spread this matter wantonly in the marketplace. Whether your majesty agrees or not, they won't suffer any losses. If your majesty agrees, then we will inevitably have to compete with them again. If your majesty disagrees, I'm afraid that it will greatly damage the prestige of our empire. This is also what they want to see. Even if I agree, what are our chances of winning?" Emperor Jing pondered for a moment and said. The old man smiled bitterly and said, "I'm afraid the chances of winning are not big. Prime Minister Qin lost in scripture, Wang Zhong lost in poetry, and Baiyu played chess with an old man and lost all 3 games. Even if we compete again, we will lose more than we win, let alone the others. There are only a few people in the Qi kingdom. Is there really no one in the Jing kingdom who can be used?" Emperor Jing asked with a sullen face. The old man shook his head and said, "Your Majesty, you are wrong. Everyone knows that Prime Minister Qin lost in scripture, Poetry Ghost lost in poetry, and Baiyu lost in chess. But they don't know that the nameless old man who competed with Prime Minister Qin is the famous great literary master of the Qi kingdom 30 years ago. He disappeared and devoted himself to literature for 30 years. How can Prime Minister Qin easily defeat him? In addition, the young man who competed with Wang Zhong in poetry is known as the greatest poet in the past millennium in the Qi kingdom. He is called the poetry saint at a young age. He is more than 10 years younger than Wang Zhong and is at the age when his mind is agile. It is not surprising that he won against Poetry Ghost. Baiyu's loss was not unjust either. Even his father could not defeat that person back then. The chess soul of the great Qi dynasty had never lost a single time since he was young. How could he live up to his reputation? The old man sighed and said, "This time, they came with the envoy of the Qi kingdom. It is obvious that they want to embarrass the Jing kingdom in front of the people of the world. They want to win back the face of the defeat on the battlefield. The great literary master of the generation calls himself a nameless old man. The young poetry saint says I am not talented. The famous chess soul of the various countries only says I have played chess for a few years and know a little. What can we do? Being inferior was being inferior. Whether the opponent was the great literary master or the poetry saint, they had suppressed the people of the Jing kingdom. It did not matter who they were. The only thing that mattered was that the people of the Qi kingdom had come to bully them. Should they accept the challenge or not? I don't believe that there is not a single capable person in the vast capital city. After an unknown period of time, Emperor Jing snorted coldly. He waved his sleeve and said, "Go and ask them how they want to compete." Chapter 460. One day, after the morning assembly, a piece of news spread like wildfire in the marketplace. The emperor had agreed to the Qi kingdom's request for a duel. The duel would be held in the palace the next day. Streets and alleys, brothels. Countless people in the capital city were discussing this matter. Damn the people of the Qi kingdom. How dare they come to our capital city and behave atrociously? We should have taught them a lesson long ago. They want to challenge the entire capital city with just a few people. How arrogant. Tomorrow will be the day to avenge themselves. These days, from the officials and nobles to the commoners, everyone in the capital city had been holding their breaths. Prime Minister Qin had lost, Shirgui had lost, and the chess saint had lost. They had lost to a few nobodies from the Qi kingdom. As citizens of the Jing kingdom, they felt humiliated. Not only were they humiliated, but they also felt aggrieved. They felt aggrieved because they did not use any underhanded tricks at all. Instead, they fought fair and square. With just a few people, they had forced the Confucians to close their doors and hide in their homes, not daring to meet anyone. Even the peddlers selling steamed buns on the street felt ashamed. Now, they could finally regain their dignity and regain their confidence. Everyone was looking forward to defeating those arrogant people in a fair and square manner tomorrow. The people of Qi are arrogant. With just a few people, they want to challenge the entire Jing kingdom. Tomorrow will be the first round of the duel. Is there anyone willing to accept the challenge on behalf of the Jing kingdom? Emperor Jing sat steadily on his throne in the Golden Hall, his gaze sweeping across the officials as he spoke in a clear voice. The generals looked around, their expressions relaxed, as if they did not care at all. The duel tomorrow was a battle of words and had nothing to do with them. It was a matter for the rotten Confucians. They just had to wait and watch the show. Their true battlefield was during martial arts battles. The civil officials lowered their heads, afraid that they would be singled out. They did not dare to meet the emperor's eyes. The Qi kingdom's envoy was despicable and cunning. The old man who had said that he had played chess for a few years and only knew a little was a national player. Even the chess saint, Bai Yu, had lost. Who in the imperial court would dare to say that they could win? Bai Yu was in the prime of his life and was at the peak of his chess skills. He was publicly acknowledged as the #1 player in the Jing kingdom, yet even he was no match for that person. Who else would dare to step forward at this moment? If they were to lose, they would become a sinner of the Jing kingdom and their reputation would be ruined. No one was willing to take this risk. For a moment, the court, which was supposed to be extremely noisy, fell into a rare silence. Is there really no one in our dynasty who dares to fight? Emperor Jing looked disappointed. In fact, when the envoy of the Qi kingdom made this request, he only had one choice. All the subjects and people in the capital, including the envoys of other countries, were watching another collision between the Qi kingdom and the Jing kingdom under the battlefield. The significance of this competition was related to the backbone of the country and the integrity of the people. It was no less important than a war. Whether the Jing kingdom would surpass the Qi kingdom again and gain great fame or be suppressed by the Qi kingdom and the people would suffer a setback, no matter what the result was, the Jing kingdom could not avoid this competition or the competition. Sigh. Suddenly, a sigh was heard in the silent court. A figure walked in from outside the hall, trembling. He bowed to Emperor Jing twice and said, "Your Majesty, I am willing to fight." A eunuch supported the old man with a terrified face. The guards at the door did not even dare to stop him. Grand Tutor Wang. "No, no. Your Majesty, Grand Tutor is old. This must not be done." When this old man with white hair and a face full of wrinkles stood out, the officials were stunned for a moment. They immediately burst into an uproar and tried to dissuade him. Grand Tutor Wang was over 80 years old and had served several generations of emperors. In terms of seniority, he was much older than Prime Minister Qin and Prime Minister Xin. He was one of the few old men in the court and did not usually have to attend court. No one knew why he was making an exception today. If this old man were to play chess with the people of Qi, the civil and military officials of the Jin kingdom would not be able to face others in the future. "Teacher, why are you? Please, have a seat." Emperor Jing stood up from the dragon throne and hurriedly ordered the guards to bring a chair. The old man did not sit down but continued to bow and said, "I am not talented, but I have played chess for a few years. Since no one in the imperial court is willing, why don't you let me play? I hope your Majesty agrees." Emperor Jing walked down from the throne and said with a bitter smile, "Teacher, why do you have to do this?" The old man sighed and said, "We cannot let outsiders think that there is no one in the Jing kingdom." When the old man's aged voice sounded, the officials looked ashamed. At this moment, a figure walked out from the crowd and bowed and said, "Your Majesty, I am willing to fight." Deputy Prime Minister Ma. Why would Deputy Prime Minister Ma? That's right, only Ma Zhongqing can do it. Ma Zhongqing and Chess Saint Baiyu are best friends, and the two of them often play chess together. Baiyu once said that if the two of them were to play seriously, the outcome would be uncertain. The person who stood out at the right time was the Deputy Prime Minister of the Imperial Censor. The officials in the court had heard of his chess skills and couldn't help but feel hopeful. "In that case, let me fight for the poetry contest." A scholar from the Directorate of Literature stood out. "I also want to debate with the Master of Literature. I hope your Majesty will allow me to do so." The speaker was a scholar from the Hongwen School. After these three people stood out, the officials didn't fight for them. After all, Deputy Prime Minister Ma Zhongqing was good at chess, Wei Sai was good at poetry, and Scholar Zhou had studied at the Hongwen School all his life. Among the officials, no one was more suitable than them for the last two contests. Among the crowd, Governor Dong Wenyun frowned. Wei Sai was indeed good at poetry. When he was young, he was known as the #1 scholar in the capital because of his poems. However, he was not as famous as the poet. Even the poet was not as famous as the poet. How could Wei Sai win against the outstanding talent of the Qi kingdom? When it came to poetry, the first person that came to his mind was, of course, that person. He was known as the #1 scholar of the Jing kingdom. All of his poems were widely spread. If he could handle the poetry contest, it would be more stable. However, Dong Wenyun wanted to mention that name, but Wei Sai had already stood out. It was not appropriate for him to say it again. Moreover, that name was a sensitive topic in the court. He could only shake his head helplessly and suppress his thoughts. In that case, the literary contest will be fought by Minister Ma, Minister Wei, and Minister Zhou. Emperor Jing's expression softened as he announced in front of the crowd. When the court was dismissed, the officials walked out one after another. However, their footsteps were not relaxed. Although the emperor had already decided on the candidates, they still didn't have much of a chance of winning. The Master of Literature, the best poet in 1,000 years, the chess soul of the Daki kingdom. Any of these titles was enough to crush people to death. Who would dare to say that they would win? The shameless envoys of the Qi kingdom had almost brought their trump cards. The hope of the literary contest was slim. It seemed that they could only pin their hopes on the martial contest. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The imperial palace will be especially lively tomorrow. Are you really not going to take a look? Li Xian stood in front of Li Yi and said temptingly. I'm not going. Li Yi said without hesitation. He found that two bow ties looked more comfortable. It was just that the tailor's craftsmanship was too poor. When Fong went to the Jade Courtyard today, he had to ask him to find a reliable tailor. You don't have to worry about being grounded. Uncle Huang has no time to care about us. I guarantee that the censors won't care either. Li Xian was looking forward to the bustling scene tomorrow and continued to tempt him. Li Yi seemed to be moved. He finally looked up at him and waved the thing in his hand in front of him. He asked, do you think one bow tie is better or two? Chapter 461. The capital was rather quiet that day. Even the hawkers on the streets were much quieter than usual. Every now and then, people would look up in the direction of the palace, thinking about the match that was going on there. The match against the people of the Qi Kingdom was a battle of honor. As citizens of the Jing Kingdom, driven by their national pride and national honor, everyone was very concerned about this matter. Some underground gambling dens even opened bets for this match. In the bustling gambling dens, countless people raised their heads in anticipation, waiting for the news to spread from the palace. In the Viscount's residence, Li Yi woke up early. He had to supervise the two tailors to work quickly. In 2 days, when the boring match against the people of the Qi Kingdom was over, his period of confinement would come to an end. He had to finish these 2 items before entering the palace. At this time, in the Golden Hall, 2 people sat cross-legged on both sides of a chessboard. On one side was Deputy Ma, and on the other was an old man with white hair and a face full of wrinkles. Today was the first match of the written examination, and it was of utmost importance. Even Emperor Jing could not sit firmly on the throne. He walked down from above, but did not get too close, watching from afar. Apart from Emperor Jing, there were only a few people in the hall. The 2 prime ministers were among them, and there were also a few old men, all famous scholars of the dynasty. On the other side, there were also several people standing behind the old man. They were all ambassadors of the Qi Kingdom, and their leader was a young man who looked to be in his early 20s. In order not to disturb the 2 people playing chess, most of the officials waited outside the hall. Countless people paced in the square, their expressions faintly anxious. Deputy Ma was in the prime of his life. It was reasonable to say that both his chess skills and physical strength were at the peak of his life. Even Chess Saint Baiyu did not dare to underestimate him. Against an old man, no matter how one looked at it, he had a great advantage. However, not long ago, when Chess Saint Baiyu played against this old man, they thought the same. But in the end, Baiyu lost all 3 matches. Today, would Deputy Ma be able to turn the tide and win the first city for the country? This was the worry of the officials and Emperor Jing, not something that Emperor Jin should be worried about. These are the pastries that Lady Mother asked the catering company to make. They're delicious. Do you want to try them? Prince Jin, Li Han, was holding an exquisite food box in his hand. He squatted on the steps of a shady place in the palace and said to the little girl sitting there with a smile on his face. Thank you, Brother Jin. I'm not hungry. The little girl turned her head and looked at the direction of the palace gate. She shook her head and said, Then I'll leave it here first. You can eat it when you're hungry. Monarch Jin put the lunchbox aside and said cautiously, Sister Yongning, I used to bully you all the time. It's all my fault. Now I know I was wrong. If anyone dares to bully you in the future, tell me and I'll beat him up for you. After thinking for a while, he added, If it's my brother, the king of Shu, I can't beat him, but I'll tell you. However, Princess Yongning didn't seem to hear him. She murmured, When will my brother come? Monarch Jin scratched his head and said, "You mean Master? Master has been grounded by Father for half a month. There are still a few days left. He won't come to the palace these days." Princess Yongning looked a little disappointed. She subconsciously hugged her arms and then remembered that the sheep was gone. Monarch Jin glanced in a certain direction and scratched his head. He said, "There seems to be something interesting in the legislative hall today. Sister Shaning and the others have already gone there. Do you want to go with me?" Seeing Yongning shake her head, Monarch Jin stood up and said, "Then I'll leave first." Outside the legislative hall, the officials were still pacing in the square. Several small figures squeezed at the door and poked their heads out to look inside. Before long, another curious head appeared. Inside the hall, as the chess game progressed, Emperor Jing and the others frowned. The wrinkled face of the old man from the state of Qi was expressionless. He was very calm when he picked up a chess piece and placed it down. On the other hand, Deputy Commander Ma's complexion was pale. Beads of sweat had appeared on his forehead. He had been holding a chess piece in his hand for a long time, but he didn't place it down. A hint of defeat flashed across Prime Minister Qin's face. He was about to lose this game. Ma Zhongqing, who could stand shoulder to shoulder with the chess saint, had only lasted for 2 hours against the old man. In the end, he still couldn't avoid losing. Sometimes, a match between experts would last for several hours. For Ma Zhongqing to lose in 2 hours was enough to show the difference in chess skills between the two. If he were to lose again tomorrow, there would be no need for the written examination. "I've lost." The chess piece in Ma Zhongqing's hand didn't land in the end. His face was dejected and he seemed to have aged a little in an instant. He stood up and said in a hoarse voice. Even though he had won, the old man opposite him didn't say a word. He stood up and silently stood opposite the young man. The officials outside the hall filed in. Just by looking at Ma Zhongqing's expression, they already had a conclusion. He had lost. As expected, he had lost. It had only been 2 hours, and the old man had become so powerful. The officials' hearts were heavy. They stood around and didn't say a word. "I was lucky to win the first game. Thank you for letting me win." The young man smiled and cupped his hands at the crowd. Emperor Jing was disappointed. He waved his hand and said, "Let's end the court today. Tomorrow, we will continue with the second round of the written examination. Your Majesty, please wait." At this moment, the young man suddenly spoke. "What else do you want?" Emperor Jing looked back at the young man and asked with a frown. The young man smiled and said, "This time, I propose to compete with your kingdom only for the sake of learning from each other. I have no other intentions. I really don't want to cause trouble for your kingdom." The officials frowned when they heard this. He didn't want to cause trouble for his kingdom. Didn't the third prince mean that if the competition continued, the Jing kingdom would continue to lose and lose face? Hearing this, the officials felt more ashamed and resentful than if they had lost the competition. "Does the third prince really think that you will win?" Before Emperor Jing could speak, Prime Minister Qin snorted coldly and said. The young man smiled and said, "Winning or losing isn't important. The purpose of this competition is to exchange and learn. If we insist on determining who is superior and who is inferior, it would lose its original meaning. I believe that even everyone here doesn't want to determine a winner and a loser, right?" The young man's words made all the officials speechless. If they had won the first round, they would not have allowed the Prince of Qi to speak so much here. The problem was that they had already lost the first round. If they lost the next round, they would not only lose their face, but also the face of the entire Jing kingdom. At that time, what would the commoners think? What would the other kingdoms think? The Qi kingdom had only brought a few people with them, yet they had defeated the Jing kingdom. Could it be that the Jing kingdom's imperial court was filled with a bunch of good-for-nothings? "What do you want?" At this time, it was not suitable for Emperor Jing to speak. Prime Minister Qin thought for a moment and looked at the young man and asked. The young man looked at Emperor Jing and said, "As long as your country agrees to a small condition of ours, there is no need to continue the competition. After the handover of the city, our envoy will immediately leave the Jing kingdom. What does your majesty think?" Although he was unwilling to admit it, if the competition continued, the possibility of the Jing kingdom losing face would only be greater. Emperor Jing looked at him and asked, "What is the condition?" "It's very simple. It's just a small request." The young man smiled and said, "There are many people in the envoy group. After staying in the capital for a long time, our travel expenses have been exhausted. We only hope that your majesty can give us some food, enough for the envoy group to return to the country." "Only food?" As soon as the young man's voice fell, not only was the expression on Emperor Jing's face startled, but the officials also showed an expression of disbelief. When it came to the face of the country, they thought that the third prince of the Qi kingdom would make some unreasonable request. As long as it was a little too much, even if His Majesty agreed, they would still strongly oppose it. But who would have thought that after spending so much effort, it was actually just a little food? For a moment, the expressions of the officials as they looked at the third prince of the Qi kingdom immediately changed subtly. It was said that the third prince of the Qi kingdom was the most capable of all the princes of the Qi kingdom and could be said to be extremely talented. Could it be that the rumors were false? Was the third prince actually the same as the king of Shu? As if not noticing the strange gazes of the officials, the young man pointed to the chessboard at the side and said, "The envoy group does not need much food. As long as your majesty sends someone to put 1 grain of rice in the first grid of the chessboard, 2 grains in the second grid, 4 grains in the third grid, and after that, each grid will have twice the amount of rice in the previous grid, and so on. You only need to put the rice on the 64th grid of the chessboard." After the young man finished speaking, he looked at Emperor Jing with a smile, waiting for his reply. Emperor Jing did not reply immediately. He looked at the chessboard at the side and then at the young man. Judging from the performance of the third prince of the Qi kingdom, he was definitely not an ordinary person. This competition had been planned for a long time, so how could it end so hastily? Relying on the food on the 64th grid of the chessboard to return to the Qi kingdom, they would probably starve to death before they reached the Qi kingdom. What do you all think? Emperor Jing looked at the officials around him and asked. Many officials rejoiced in their hearts. They hadn't expected that the third prince of the Qi kingdom would be a fool. This was great news for them. Although there were some who suspected that there might be a scheme behind this, the third prince only wanted some rations. So, they could just give it to him. What kind of scheme could he play with a few bags of rations? "Your Majesty, since the ambassadors of the Qi kingdom are so short of food, we naturally can't refuse. We can't let the ambassadors of other countries starve. This is not appropriate." Assistant Minister Chen Bo stood up and said with a smile. "Your Excellency Chen is right. If we refuse, it will seem that we are stingy. It's not easy for the third prince to come from afar. Why not satisfy his request?" Things took a turn, and the officials all smiled and spoke. If they could use some food to send away the troublesome people of the Qi kingdom, it was a good deal no matter how they looked at it. At that time, they could say that the people of the Qi kingdom were afraid, so they asked for some food and went back to the Qi kingdom. His Majesty was kind and gave them some food. Not only did they save face, but they also saw the people of the Qi kingdom as a joke. Why not? Where are the professors of mathematics in the Imperial College? Emperor Jing pondered for a moment and suddenly asked. When Chancellor Jing heard this, he immediately went forward and said, "Your Majesty, except for Professor Han, the other professors of mathematics went to the Li County mansion to ask for mathematics. They are not in the court." The reason why this Professor Han came today was that he wanted to ask for a proper imperial edict from His Majesty. Otherwise, he would not even be able to enter the gate of the Li family. Chancellor Jing waved his hand behind him, and immediately a middle-aged man walked over quickly. Emperor Jing was a little regretful. If he knew this, he should have called Li Yi here today. He had never let him down. With him here, why should he worry about these things? Do you know how much food they want? Emperor Jing looked at Professor Han and asked. Professor Han pondered for a moment and said, Your Majesty, it's only 64 squares. It won't be a lot. Professor Han looked at the chessboard. As a professor of mathematics, he naturally thought more than the other officials. Due to the multiplication, 64 squares were actually not a small number. However, how big was a grain of rice? 1 stone of rice was already innumerable. Even if 64 squares could not be filled, 10 stones would not be enough, and 100 stones would not be enough, right? The Jing kingdom did not lack those 100 or so meters of rice. Using this amount of rice to send off the Qi kingdom's envoy was a very good deal. It was rare for the officials to have the same opinion on this matter. Emperor Jing suppressed the only worry in his heart and said, In that case, then, the third prince of the Qi kingdom still had a faint smile on his face. The expressions on the officials' faces were also quite satisfied. Everyone was happy and well. Wait a minute, the harmonious atmosphere was suddenly broken by a voice. After being stunned for a moment, everyone turned their heads and looked in the direction of the voice. Prince Jin, Li Han, stood at the door of the hall. When he saw so many people in the hall looking at him, he couldn't help but feel a little scared. But he still forced himself to muster up courage and interrupted Emperor Jing's words, saying, Father, you can't agree with them. In front of the envoy of the Qi kingdom and the civil and military officials, Emperor Jing's words were interrupted by Prince Jin, but he was not angry at all. Instead, his face showed a thoughtful expression. The third prince of the Qi kingdom's expression changed slightly. He looked at the little fat man standing at the door of the hall with a trace of surprise in his eyes. Your Highness, this is the court. Don't make trouble here. The officials quickly reacted. They didn't care about their identity and spoke out to stop him. This was a great advantage. They must not let Prince Jin ruin it. Next time, they might not meet such a stupid prince. Most of the officials stopped Prince Jin, but a few people's faces changed at the same time. Minister of the Ministry of Revenue Qin Huan, Minister of War Yan Bing, Chancellor of the Imperial College, and the Professor of Mathematics. No one knew better than them how many incredible things were in this fat head. Han, come here and talk. Emperor Jing smiled and waved to Prince Jin. Seeing that his father was not angry, Prince Jin was relieved. He walked over slowly, pointed at the young man, and said to Emperor Jing, Father, don't be cheated by them. My teacher said that all the countries in the world can't fill the 64 squares of the chessboard. If we build a big warehouse to store all the food, the warehouse should be 3 feet long, 6 feet wide, and high as the sun. The third prince of the Qi kingdom's expression did not change, but he sighed in his heart. For the first time, he looked at the little fat man in front of him seriously. Yes, there are so many. The Chancellor of the Imperial College said in a trembling voice. The face of Professor Han, who had just spoken, turned pale. He only felt that his eyes were a little black. If it was only Prince Jin, he still had a glimmer of hope in his heart. But the problem was that he just said, my teacher said. Prince Jin's teacher was none other than the mysterious Li Xianzi. He taught Prince Jin, who was a naughty child, to sweep the mathematics students of the Imperial College and make the professors of mathematics extremely ashamed. How could he talk nonsense without any basis? Chapter 462. Prince Jin, are you serious? Qin Huan, the Minister of Revenue, stepped forward and asked Li Han anxiously. Yes, sir. Li Han casually put the blame on Li Yi. With his current mathematics level, he couldn't handle such a terrible number. A granary as high as the sun was frightening. Professor Han, are you serious? It's only 64 squares. Are there really so many? Where are the people from the Imperial College? Come out and say something. After a moment of silence, the officials finally reacted when they saw the expressions of several important people, but they still couldn't believe what Prince Jean had just said. A granary as high as the sun was 30 feet long and 20 feet wide. Who was he bluffing? The sun was very far away from here. How did Prince Jean calculate this number? The only mathematics professor from the Imperial College in the court immediately became the focus of everyone's attention. Professor Han trembled and said, Since it's Li Xianzi's words, then it should be correct. Fortunately, I brought it with me. Li Han patted his butt and took out a tattered booklet from his arms. He dipped his saliva in it and quickly flipped through it. This booklet was specially made for him. There were not only strange problems in it, but also interesting stories interspersed every few pages. For Prince Jean, who often struggled in the sea of problems, this was undoubtedly a small island for him to temporarily rest on. Therefore, he still remembered the stories in the booklet. Found it. Prince Jean finally turned to a page and presented it to Emperor Jing. Father, look, it's here. Emperor Jing looked at the page that Prince Jean had turned to. After a moment, he flicked his sleeves and said, Since it's a competition, there should be a beginning and an end. If your country's envoys can't gather enough food for the return trip, I will give you travel expenses. Tomorrow's competition will continue as usual. Don't be late. After that, Emperor Jing walked out surrounded by several eunuchs. The officials who finally knew the truth felt their faces burn. They wanted to skin the third prince of the Qi kingdom alive. Shameful, this was a great disgrace. All the civil and military officials in the court were not as good as the 9-year-old Prince Jean. They almost made a big mistake. It was hard to imagine that if His Majesty and them agreed to the third prince's request, the ruler and ministers of the Jing kingdom would become the laughingstock of all the other countries. They naturally wouldn't take out those rations. Not to mention the fact that they didn't have that much rations. Even if they did, they couldn't possibly give it to the Qi kingdom for free. If you want rations, you can just give it to a few Tian Fa heavenly kings. But if he didn't give it to Prince Jean, as the king of a country, how could he go back on his words? Otherwise, how could he stay in other countries in the future? It could be said that if Prince Jean was a moment late, the Jing kingdom would lose its face. The third prince of the Qi kingdom and the envoys walked out of the golden palace under the baptism of the gazes of the officials. There was a hint of disappointment on the face of the young man who was walking in front. If they had succeeded in what they had just done, they could have spread the news before the Jing kingdom reacted. By then, they would have achieved their ultimate goal without having to compete with each other. It seems that I have underestimated the heroes of the world, the young man sighed and said in a regretful tone. One of the envoys behind him said, So what if they find out? The result will be the same. If they lose another round tomorrow, there will be no need to compete in the written exam. As for the martial arts battle, we are not afraid at all. Why is the third prince sighing? The young man shook his head and didn't continue this topic. He said, Find out who the teacher of Prince Jean is. That difficult calculation problem was solved by Grand Scholar Qin. It took more than 10 accountants 3 days and 3 nights to calculate the result. I didn't expect there to be such a capable person in the Jing kingdom who knew the secret of it. Otherwise, it's a pity. Seeing the envoy of the Qi kingdom walk out of the grand palace, the anger of the officials because they were fooled by the envoy subsided a little. They had thought that the third prince of the Qi kingdom was a fool, but they didn't expect that they were the real fools. They had almost fallen into his trap. He was so insidious and cunning at such a young age, he wouldn't live long. When he shifted his gaze to Prince Jean, his expression immediately became gentle. Very good. Like father, like son. The 9-year-old Prince Jean had seen through the conspiracy of the envoy of another kingdom in the imperial court and saved the face of His Majesty and the officials. His deed was worthy of being recorded in the annals of history. The officials' joy didn't last long. They realized a serious problem. Though the conspiracy of the envoy of the Qi kingdom had been exposed by Prince Jean, they had already lost the first round of the written examination today. If they lost again tomorrow, there would be no need to compete in the third round. Therefore, the match tomorrow was very important. They couldn't afford to lose. Otherwise, they would lose face sooner or later. The Imperial Academy guard's size face darkened. It was his turn to compete tomorrow. In fact, he wasn't sure whether he could win or not, the greatest poet in 1,000 years. This name alone was a bit frightening. Because of the announcement of the envoy of the Qi kingdom, the populace in the capital had already received the news before the officials left the palace. They had lost. They had lost to the Qi kingdom in the first round of the written examination. In the gambling house, countless people were cursing at Ma Zhongqing. This defeat was not a big deal, but many of them would have to bear a huge loss. Many of them would go bankrupt. Who would have thought that the countless capable people in the capital would lose to a nameless old man from the Qi kingdom at their own doorstep? How ironic was this? The enthusiasm of the common people was greatly dampened, and the entire capital was filled with a gloomy atmosphere. Quite a few people blamed this failure on Ma Zhongqing. Rumors spread everywhere, directly labeling Ma Zhongqing as a sinner of the country. No one knew how many rotten eggs and vegetables were thrown over the wall into the Ma Manor. The dignified deputy imperial censor was hit in the forehead by a stone thrown by a naughty child on his way home. After hearing the rumors, he fainted on the spot. Not only that, the populace also had a lot of complaints about the current emperor. Although they weren't as blatant as they were against Ma Zhongqing, they were secretly criticizing His Majesty the Emperor. As Li Yi listened to Li Xian, he reminded the two tailors of the details that they needed to pay attention to. I heard that the third prince of the Qi kingdom had set up a trap for the emperor and the officials in the court. If it weren't for Prince Jin's reminder, we would have lost a lot of face this time. Li Xian's face was full of resentment. If we lose another round tomorrow, we'll lose completely to the Qi kingdom in the written examination. After listening to Li Xian's narration a few times, Li Yi had a general understanding of the so-called contest. It was nothing more than a few high-level players who had played the game to the highest level, pretending to be newbies to bully a group of newbies. Of course, those who could represent the Jing kingdom were not newbies, but it was obvious that there was still a long way to go before they could reach the highest level. The Qi kingdom seemed to be more powerful than the Jing kingdom in terms of economy, culture, and military. It was impossible for the Qi kingdom to win this contest unless someone had cheated. Poor Deputy Imperial Censor Ma, Li Yi sighed. As a dignified Deputy Imperial Censor, what he cared about the most was his own reputation. This time, he was directly called a sinner of the country. It was hard to say if he could get over this hurdle. Judging from the situation, Wei Sai and Grand Scholar Zhou were in danger. Fortunately, the old emperor didn't remember him, otherwise, he would be scolded to death by those ignorant onlookers. Summon county magistrate Li to the palace tomorrow morning. As Li Yi was thinking of this, the Jing emperor said this while waving his hand in the hall of diligent government while holding a book of poems titled, The Collection of Bright Moon, in his hand. Chapter 463. Tomorrow's contest is very important. No matter what, I plan to go to the palace to have a look. Li Xian's expression was firm. As a member of the Li royal family, he naturally valued this contest more than ordinary people. After saying that, he turned back to look at Li Yi and said, "Aren't you quite good at writing poems? Can you beat that millennium poetry genius?" That nickname sounds scary, but I don't know if he's really that good. Of course. Li Yi said casually. Then he turned to a tailor and said, "Just follow that painting." Don't change anything. So what if he was the best poet in 1,000 years? Fame was not something to brag about. Moreover, the development of poetry in this world had long been led into the gutter by someone. If the former Tang dynasty followed the established historical development, Li Bai, Du Fu, Wang Wei, Bai Ji, any one of these people would be added with the word 10,000 years in front of their titles. King Zhong, the poetry demon, was said to be good at fusing words and galloping at the imagination. That was why he was called the poetry demon. Fortunately, Li Yi's coffin was suppressed. Otherwise, the real poetry demon would jump out and beat people up. They were the true gods of poetry. In terms of poetry, they belonged to another plane of existence compared to this world. Standing on the shoulders of so many great people, how could they not be able to kill a scholar from the Qi kingdom? If he lost, the coffins of those great writers would really be broken. That's true. Li Xian shook his head. Although he did not know much about poetry, he knew that Li Yi was very famous in Qing and prefecture. However, even King Zhong, the poetry demon, admitted that he was not as good as that young man from the Qi kingdom. Li Yi definitely could not do it. He had indeed asked a superfluous question. Lord Zhu, do you think this will work? The two tailors wiped the sweat from their foreheads and looked carefully at this strange Lord Zhu. They had never seen such a huge doll before. Not only did it have a strange shape, it also had a lot of requests. Furthermore, when they were working, this Lord Zhu was watching them and reminding them 10 times every 2 hours. No tailor could stand it. Okay, it's not bad. Li Yi waved his hand and said, go to Butler Li to receive your reward. The two tailors felt as if they had been pardoned and their faces were filled with joy. This lord was not good at all, but his temperament of rewarding without a word was very popular. The two tailors thanked him for a while and immediately went to find Butler Li. Li Xian looked at the two strange things in front of him. He didn't know what was so special about the things that Li Yi had been busy with for the past few days. Son-in-law, the people from the Imperial College have come again. Fong leaned against the door and said, they brought gifts this time, and they are quite heavy. I asked the gatekeeper to send a few cups of tea over, and they are still waiting outside. Li Xian asked in confusion, why are the people from the Imperial College looking for you? Go out and have a look. The people from the Imperial College had visited the Viscount's mansion more than 3 times, and the gifts were heavier each time. They also let the people stand outside the door and bask in the sun. It was really unreasonable. At the very least, they should see each other before basking in the sun. Jing Darren, do we really have to wait like this? Outside the Viscount's mansion, a doctor of mathematics looked at the Chancellor and asked with a bitter face. The rest of the people also looked at him. This was not a slow treatment. They had been visiting for several days, and they had given countless gifts. But today, they could only drink a cup of tea. They didn't even get to enter the door. No one would feel good in their heart. Wait. The Chancellor gritted his teeth. Today, Prince Jin's performance in the court finally made him clearly aware of the difference between the Imperial College and Li Xianzi. Now that His Majesty has realized the importance of the new mathematics, it was okay for the Imperial College to make a mistake once or twice, but if they were to be slapped in the face by Prince Jin a few more times, they would lose face. If the Imperial College was abolished, the Chancellor would definitely surpass his predecessors and leave his name in history. Just when everyone was waiting anxiously, a few figures finally appeared at the entrance of the Viscount's mansion. My apologies for the long wait. His Majesty's confinement period hasn't ended yet, so he can't leave the residence. If you have anything to say, please come in and talk. Li Yi stood at the door and said to the people from the Directorate. Li Yi was very clear about how many times these people from the Imperial College had snitched on him. Naturally, he would not treat them as distinguished guests, so he spoke in an indifferent tone. The chancellor was not surprised by Li Yi's attitude at all. He stepped forward and said with a smile, "Under His Majesty's order, I brought the Doctor of Mathematics from the Imperial College to learn the new mathematics from Li Xianzi. For the sake of, since it is His Majesty's order, you can listen to it in the Bowen Hall from now on." Li Yi thought for a moment and said, how free was he to waste time teaching these people? Mathematics was a road of no return. There was only a starting point and no end. When the time came, he could just throw some unreasonable equations and mingle with calculus, and it would be enough for them to study until they retired. Thank you, Li Xianzi. So be it. At least he would feel more at ease. The Chancellor of Kingdom didn't think that County Magistrate Li would put aside his prejudice against them and teach them seriously. He didn't stay any longer. After expressing his gratitude, he left with the Directorate of Kingdom. Li Yi had already heard about Prince Jin Li Han's matter. This kid didn't let me worry about him during the holidays. He made so many things. It must be because he left too little homework. It seemed that it was time to write another booklet. Early in the morning, the sky had just brightened. Li Yi rubbed his sleepy eyes and looked at the two eunuchs standing in the yard. He turned around and walked into the house. Oh, the confinement period is not over yet. I'm going back to sleep for a while. Don't wake me up if there's nothing important, and don't wake me up if there's something. Anyone who was woken up before dawn would not be in a good mood. Li Yi yawned a few times and crossed the threshold. His Majesty knew that you would be lazy, so he specially sent this old man here. A gloomy voice came from behind. Changde grabbed his collar and pulled him back. He said, Li Xianzi, you'd better come with this old man. He nodded slightly to Rui, who was standing on the side, and then dragged Li Yi out of the door. It turned out to be Changde, this old guy. This old guy was quite strong. It seemed that he couldn't sleep in today. When he was dragged away by the old guy, he told Rui to remember to leave some food for him in the morning. The next moment, he was pushed into the carriage. Wait a minute. Seeing the old guy turned over and got on the horse as if he was going to leave immediately, Li Yi quickly said. Changde looked back and said, is there anything else? If His Majesty's important matter is delayed, you and I can't afford to bear the consequences. I'm going back to get something. Li Yi jumped off the carriage and entered the Viscount's mansion. After a while, he came out with two things in his arms. Changde glanced at him and gently waved his whip. The carriage started moving. Chief Chang. The carriage had not entered the city yet, and it was too bumpy to sleep. Li Yi was a little bored. He opened the window and looked at Changde. Speak. Changde said without turning his head. A trace of curiosity appeared on Li Yi's face. Can I ask you a question? This old man has never practiced the Sunflower Treasure Book. Not that. Li Yi looked at him and asked, why don't you call yourself this old man? Changde raised his eyebrows. Why should this old man call himself this old man? Bastard scriptwriter. Li Yi rolled down the window, leaned on the sheepdoll, murmured, and closed his eyes. Chapter 464. After the carriage entered the bluestone streets of the capital, it gradually steadied. Changde waved at the guards at the palace gate, and the carriage went straight into the palace. The happiest thing in the morning was to have a good sleep after waking up. Although sleeping in the carriage was not as comfortable as sleeping on a bed, it was good to have something soft to lean on. Li Yi only woke up when the carriage suddenly stopped and his head bumped into the carriage. He must have seen too many beautiful goats recently. He actually dreamed that he was catching goats on a green grassland. If Changde did not suddenly stop, he would still be fighting with Pleasant Goat in his dream. County Magistrate Li, it's time to get off. An uncomfortable voice came from outside. Li Yi unwillingly got off the carriage. He looked around and suddenly exclaimed, why are we here? His Majesty and a few important officials are at the Hall of Diligent Government. County Magistrately, quickly follow me. Changda's voice was always so annoying. No, I have to go back for a while. Li Yi shook his head and said. Changda frowned and asked, where? Li Yi pointed and said, the palace in front. Changda glanced at the direction and said, County Magistrately, if you want to see Princess Yongning, wait until you see His Majesty first. No, I don't have the time later. Li Yi sat back on the carriage. Changda smiled sinisterly, then don't blame me. With that, he strode towards Li Yi. What do you want? I'm telling you, don't touch me, let me give you a piece of advice. Don't provoke me. I'm even afraid of myself when I'm angry. My head hurts. Don't tell me my hysteria is acting up again. The smile on Changda's face froze. The 6-year-old girl sat on the stone steps in the shade outside the palace and looked in the direction of the palace gate. Although she had been doing this for a year, she was completely different from before. The stupidity on her face was gone, and her eyes were full of intelligence. When there was a meaning to waiting, everything suddenly became clear. A few eunuchs and palace maids were standing in the distance. When they saw the little princess smile from time to time, they looked excited. Li Xianzi was really a man of God. He cured the little princess's strange disease that even the imperial doctors couldn't do anything about. They were happy to see the little princess's change these days. It was a pity that Li Xianzi was grounded by His Majesty because he beat the king of Shu. Otherwise, the little princess would definitely smile more. Yongning looked in that direction again, thinking that her brother would not be coming today. She turned around and saw 2 goat horns tied with a bow, as well as, the first thing she saw in this world that she was familiar with in her memory. Li Yi saw the surprise in her eyes. He pushed the doll that was as tall as Yongning over and asked with a smile, do you like it? After the little girl came back to her senses, she suddenly pounced forward. However, she did not pounce on the beautiful sheep doll that Li Yi had carefully prepared for her, but Li Yi himself. Looking at the little figure hugging him tightly, Li Yi was stunned for a moment. Then, he lovingly caressed her head. Changda stood behind them, and a trace of doubt appeared on his old face. What he couldn't understand the most was that Princess Yongning was so intimate with Li Yi, even more than His Majesty. Was it because Li Xianzi cured her disease? After this thought came to his mind, he faintly felt that things were not so simple. Humph. When Yongning let go of him and finally focused her attention on the beautiful sheep doll, a cold snort suddenly came from behind Li Yi. The sound was familiar, and so was the scene. Li Yi turned around and saw the proud Lolita standing there with her hands on her hips like a tigress, looking at him with extremely fierce eyes. One should not fall at the same place twice. When Li Yi turned around and dragged out another doll that was almost the same as the previous one from the carriage, but it was bigger than the previous one, and about the same height as Princess Shining, the proud Lolita screamed and pounced on it. Regardless of ancient times or modern times, plush toys, especially large plush toys, had an unparalleled attraction for girls. This was because such large toys could bring them a great sense of security. Of course, the premise was that the girl was really a girl and still retained a young girl's heart. Tomboys and girls' mothers had already broken away from this low-level sense of security and were generally excluded. Thank you, sir. Princess Shining, who finally recovered from her excitement, immediately pounced on Li Yi. She jumped up and hung on him like a koala, and kissed his face. Only then did she realize that the person in front of her was Sir and not her mother. Her little face turned red, and she ran away with her beautiful sheep doll. Ahem. When Li Yi squatted down and whispered to Yongning, Changda finally could not help coughing twice. Li Yi turned around, looked at him, and said with concern, Chief Chang, if you are not feeling well, you should go back and rest. Don't worry about me. The chief chamberlain's eyelids twitched, and he forcibly suppressed the surging genuine qi in his body. He said in a low voice, "Li Xianzi, have you forgotten something?" "What is it?" Li Yi looked puzzled. Crack! The green bricks under Changda's feet were broken. There was still an hour before the second competition with the Qi Kingdom officially began. Hall of Diligent Government. Emperor Jing was high up, and there were more than 10 figures in the hall, including the left and right ministers, the 6 ministers, the capital governor Dong Wenyun, Li Xian, and Emingzu were also in the crowd. Subject Wei, do you think you can win today? Emperor Jing looked at Wei Sai and asked directly. Wei Sai showed a bitter expression and said, "I will do my best." Even Li Xian could tell that Wei Sai was not confident, let alone the old foxes in the court who were good at reading people's expressions. Although he said he would do his best, Wei Sai obviously did not have the confidence to win today's competition. However, to the emperor and the ministers of the Jing kingdom, they did not want Wei Sai to do his best. They wanted to win, and they had to win. Wei Sai should know the significance of this competition for us. Prime Minister Qin suddenly said, and looked at him, "I only have one question, what are your chances of winning?" Wei Sai thought for a long time, and then said with difficulty, 30%. The hearts of the people in the hall also sank when they heard Wei Sai's words. 30% was not a number they expected, after all, they wanted 100%. However, after the poetry demon Wang Zhong admitted defeat, Wei Sai was their most capable person. If even Wei Sai only had a 30% chance of winning, the others might not even have a 10% chance of winning. As for the so-called scholars of the younger generation in the capital, in their eyes, the poems of those people were just children's tricks, and should not be taken seriously. That person is not even 30 years old, is he really that good? Emperor Jing asked with a frown. The old man next to Prime Minister Qin stepped forward and said, "Your Majesty, Xiao Xiuwen is very famous in the Qi Kingdom, and he is known as the first poet in 1,000 years. Although this is exaggerated, it is enough to show his talent, and talent, in the way of poetry, is often more important than hard work." Hearing Prime Minister Shen's words, the dozen or so officials in the court felt very depressed. Why did they have to meet such a rare freak of 1,000 years? Why did the Jing kingdom not have such a freak? Dong Wenyun's lips moved. He wanted to say that everyone, including His Majesty, had neglected one person. As the former magistrate of Qinghen, he knew the boy's talent. Did they really think that Su Shuozhing's evaluation of him as the first scholar of the Jing kingdom was a joke? However, Wei Sai was still there, and in front of so many officials, it was not good for him to say these words. Emperor Jing sighed helplessly and said, "Could it be that in this big capital, there is really no one who can beat that Zhao? Your Majesty, Li Xianzi has arrived, and he is waiting with Princess Yongning outside the hall." Just as Emperor Jing's voice fell, Changde walked in from outside and said loudly. Chapter 465. Seeing Li Yi holding Yongning's hand and walking in from outside, Emperor Jing was a little depressed. His daughter was even more intimate to an outsider than herself. For a father, this was not something to be happy about. However, thinking that if it wasn't for Li Yi, her soullessness would not be cured. He was afraid that he would not be able to hear her call him Imperial Father until he died. He felt much better. "Yongning, come to Imperial Father." Emperor Jing waved to Yongning with a pleasant face. The little girl looked up at Li Yi and then walked up with small steps. Li Xian leaned over and whispered, "Didn't you say that you were not interested in these things? Why are you here again?" Li Yi glanced up and did not speak. If it wasn't for the person above, he would still be busy catching sheep on the green grassland. How would he have time to care about these things? Li Xian did not have a chance to say a second sentence to Li Yi. Dong Wenyun walked over and whispered, "This time, I recommended you to His Majesty. Tell me the truth. What do you think of Zhao Xiuan of the Qi kingdom compared to you? Only then did Li Yi know why he was suddenly summoned to the palace during his confinement. It turned out that he was betrayed by this guy. After all, they came from the same place. Wouldn't his conscience hurt if he betrayed his hometown? Li Yi did not answer Dong Wenyun because after Emperor Jing let Princess Yongning sit down next to him, he directly asked Li Yi, "This is urgent." "I will not say more. I just want to ask you one thing. If I let you participate in today's competition, what are your chances of winning?" Hearing Emperor Jing's words, Wei Sai raised his head. Prime Minister Qin also seemed to think of something. Dong Wenyun's eyes turned slightly. The rest of the people's faces were a little stunned. Was His Majesty going to let this Li Xianzi participate in the second competition? This poem, I actually only know a little about it. Li Yi was taken aback when he heard that. He said slowly, "Moreover, writing poems and lyrics depends on the state and mood of the moment. There's no such thing as confidence, young Li is right." Old General Shui, who had been dozing off while leaning against the pillar, finally opened his eyes. He waved his hand and said, "Isn't it just 2 poems? What's there to compare? I just feel that whatever best poet wrote was bullsh*t. Who dares to object?" Li Yi deeply agreed with this. As expected of old General Shui, this was the domineering attitude that a large country should have. No matter how good Zhao Xiuan's poems were, this was the Jing kingdom. This was their territory. If anyone dared to say that Wei Sai's poems were not as good as Zhao Xiuan's, they could just drag him out and bury him. Wouldn't everyone's opinion be the same? What was the point of making things so troublesome? Qin Xiang frowned, as if he was too lazy to discuss this matter with old General Shui, so he simply kept his mouth shut. All the civil officials had bitter smiles on their faces. Since ancient times, there was no first in literature. Everyone had their preferences. Old General Shui's words seemed reasonable, but did he think that all the civil and military officials in the imperial court, including the emperor, were as shameless as him? General Shui's words are wrong. If it were true, then wouldn't our Jing kingdom become the laughingstock of all the other countries? The Minister of Rights, an old man with white hair, said with a frown. "Let's see who dares to laugh." Old General Shui glared and the Minister of Rights swallowed back his words. Jing Di patted Yongning's head. Seeing the atmosphere in the hall become chaotic again, he rubbed his chest and felt suffocated again. In the end, he did not sleep enough in the morning. Li Yi yawned and prepared to take advantage of their discussion to close his eyes and take a nap. Suddenly, he felt someone tugging on his sleeve. Mingzu walked to his side and looked at him. She said, "We cannot lose today. Be more serious, I know you have a way. Keep a low profile, keep a low profile." Li Yi stretched out his hand and gestured for her to lower her voice. Old General Shui's way was the best way. Fists were the hard way. If they were not convinced, they could fight. If the Qi kingdom was really powerful, they could eat a few divine punishment pills first. When you beat up the king of Shu, did you think about keeping a low profile? Mingzu glanced at him and said, I thought about it, Li Yi said hesitantly. If he had not thought about keeping a low profile at that time, the officials would not have seen County Magistrate Li beating up the king of Shu, but County Magistrate Li killing the king of Shu. County Magistrate of Chang'an, Li Yi, follow me. Jing Di suddenly stood up and pointed at Li Yi. After he finished speaking, he walked towards the back of the palace. Li Yi was startled for a moment. He looked at Li Xian and then at Li Mingzhu. Seeing that they were also puzzled, he could only follow them in confusion. Behind the Hall of Diligent Government was the garden that Li Yi often visited. When Li Yi followed Changde to the garden, he saw Jing Di standing in the stone pavilion in the garden. Is there really no chance of winning? Jing Di looked back at him and asked. It's difficult. Li Yi sighed and said. Jingdi's face showed a trace of thinking, and then he said, I heard from Xian that you want to take Yongning out of the palace. Although he did not know why the old emperor suddenly mentioned this, Li Yi's eyes lit up and he said, yes, the atmosphere in the palace is too depressing, and it is not suitable for Princess Yongning's treatment. If her soullessness relapses, even I can do nothing. Yongning is a princess of a country. Her status is so noble. How can she easily leave the palace? Jingdi shook his head and said, even if I agree, the officials in the court will not agree, nor will the censors. A trace of helplessness appeared on Li Yi's face. Of course, he knew this. It was not so easy for a young prince to leave the palace. If something happened to him, it would cause a huge shock in the entire capital. Yongning was too young now. No one, from the emperor to the court officials, would agree to her leaving the palace. He was just thinking about it. If you win this competition, I will allow you to take Yongning out of the palace for a month, but her range of activity is limited to 10 miles around the Viscount's residence. Hearing Jingdi's words, Li Yi's expression froze. The light in his eyes soared. He suddenly raised his head and asked, Your Majesty, are you serious? How sure are you now? Jingdi did not expect that he had changed so much. After a moment of shock, he looked at him and asked with a faint smile. Li Yi's eyes flashed fiercely, Your Majesty, how do you want them to die? I am really a failure as an emperor. I have to rely on the help of the children again and again. The first 2 times it was Han, and this time it is Yongning. Jingdi's face was no longer worried and he said with a teasing smile. Your Majesty, this boy is too outrageous. Can't he take the initiative to stand up and share the burden for Your Majesty? Changde, who had always been indifferent, showed a rare trace of anger on his face. If Your Majesty did not bring out Princess Yongning this time, I don't know how long he would hide. Isn't the result the same? Jingdi smiled and said disapprovingly. Chapter 466. What did my father say to you just now? When they came out of the Hall of Diligent Government, they saw Li Yi holding Yongning's hand and humming a light and nameless tune. It was obvious that he was in a good mood. So, Mingzu walked up to him and asked. You will know when we go to the Hall of Political Integrity. Li Yi replied casually and whispered something in Yongning's ear. The little girl's eyes instantly lit up. Li Mingzhu's expression changed slightly. She instantly understood what he was referring to, and her heart that was hanging in the air finally relaxed. Li Xian's expression was also slightly excited. He immediately looked forward to the competition. This is a serious matter. Your Majesty, please reconsider. County Li is indeed talented in mathematics. But today's competition can't be treated as a child's play. Your Majesty, please take back your order. We can't lose again. Hearing the news just announced by Emperor Jing, several high-ranking officials in the imperial court changed their expressions and stepped forward to persuade him. They had long been accustomed to Li Yi's ability to surprise him at the critical moment. How could they not know that Li Yi was 100% confident when they saw his expression just now? At this moment, they didn't bother to explain to the officials. They waved their hands and said, I have made up my mind. You don't need to say more. It's almost time. Follow me to the Hall of Political Integrity. Your Majesty, several officials still wanted to say something, but Emperor Jing had already walked out of the hall. Your Majesty, you are too hasty. Could it be that County Li's attainments in poetry are higher than Wei Sai's? I'm afraid that he will lose today. The minister of the Ministry of Rights said with a worried expression. A trace of despair even appeared on the faces of the officials behind him. How could a young man in his 20s compare with Wei Sai, who had studied poetry for decades? His Majesty's momentary play would make the Jing kingdom pay a heavy price. Wei Sai, on the other hand, didn't show any disappointment or anger. Instead, he seemed relieved. After all, in a situation where he would lose more than he would win, he would also have a lot of psychological pressure. Of course, it would be good if he won, but if he lost, Ma Zhongqing would be an example to him. He would be reviled by the people of the capital and even the entire Jing kingdom. Just the thought of it was frightening. If it was not necessary, who would be willing to bet their reputation on this match? That Li Xianzi was still too young, and youthful vigor often came at a great price. It was rare that Prime Minister Qin didn't express any opinion on this matter. Among the people present, even Dong Wenyun didn't know county magistrate Li better than him. If even Wei Sai did not have the confidence to win, then His Majesty's decision was probably the most correct one. The Hall of Legislative Affairs was where all the officials attended the morning court. However, from yesterday onwards, the morning court session was no longer the most important activity of the Hall of Legislative Affairs. There was nothing more important than winning the contest against the Qi Kingdom. More than 10 core officials and Emperor Jing were discussing important matters in the Hall of Legislative Affairs, while the others were waiting outside the Hall of Legislative Affairs. When Li Yi and the others arrived, there were already many people outside the hall. It was not time yet, so the doors of the hall were not opened. When the three of them walked to a secluded corner with few people, Li Xian, who had been talking to Amingzu in a low voice, suddenly froze. Then he walked to the side with a happy expression, patted a young man's shoulder, and said in surprise, "Brother, we meet again." The young man turned his head and looked a little surprised. When he saw Li Xian, he showed a puzzled expression. Soon, he understood and said, "You are the one from the jadeite courtyard." Li Yi and Amingzu walked over. When he saw the young man, he was also a little surprised. Last time in the jadeite courtyard, because there were no seats, Li Xian took the initiative to share a table with him. Although they didn't talk much, Li Yi had a good impression of him. It was indeed surprising to meet him in the imperial palace this time. "Why are you here?" Li Xian looked at him and asked curiously, "Are you also an official of the imperial court? Why haven't I seen you before?" The young man was speechless and didn't know how to answer. Mingzu looked at Li Xian in surprise. The crowd in the distance looked over and there was also a small commotion. Li Yi looked at the young man and the people behind him. He turned his head and looked around. Seeing the expressions on the officials' faces, he thought to himself, "It can't be such a coincidence, can it? The third prince of the Qi kingdom." Li Yi looked at him and asked uncertainly. At this special time, he was excluded by the officials of the Jing kingdom. These people clearly saw him as their leader. Other than the famous third prince, there seemed to be no one else. "Brotherly, we meet again." The young man smiled and cupped his hands in salute to them. Li Xian was stunned and didn't recover from the surprise for a moment. Li Yi saluted the young man and pulled on Li Xian's sleeve, pulling him to another place. This was not a suitable occasion to get close to the young man. The person with them seems to be the eldest princess of the Jing kingdom. "Do you know them, third prince?" After Li Yi and the other two left, an old man came up and asked. The young man smiled and said, "I've met them once. They are two interesting people." He didn't continue on this topic and asked, "The second round of the competition is about to begin. Brother Xiuwen, are you ready?" The other young man leaned against a pillar and was engrossed in a book. He didn't answer. The third prince of the Qi kingdom shook his head. The poetry addict was indeed a poetry addict. On the other side, Mingzu looked at Li Yi and Li Xian suspiciously. Before she could ask the question in her heart, there was a sudden commotion. Not far away, Jing Di, accompanied by Xiang Qin and the others, slowly walked over. The officials looked excited and followed Jing Di into the main hall. The third prince of the Qi kingdom looked at the young man behind him and said, "Let's go." The young man stood up and closed the book in his hand. He looked in the direction of the main hall and smiled. I hope today's competition will be interesting. The court was strangely quiet. It wasn't because they were worried that the noise would affect the competition, but because of the decision His Majesty had just announced. The candidate for this competition was not Wei Sai, but Li Xianzi. His Majesty's actions had undoubtedly killed off their last glimmer of hope before the competition even began. If the envoy of the Qi Kingdom was not in the hall, the Golden Hall would have been in chaos. The crowd looked at Li Yi with confusion, pity, and even resentment. But no matter what kind of emotion they had no hope for the result of today's competition. Li Xianzi. An imperceptible light flashed in the eyes of the third prince of the Qi Kingdom, but it quickly disappeared. As for the young man, he looked slightly regretful. He waited for the third prince to draw a stick from a bamboo tube. When he saw the word dusk on it, he closed his eyes and pondered. Naturally, this poetry competition would not be free to express themselves. There were dozens of sticks in the bamboo tube, with different contents written on them, such as expressing one's feelings and expressing one's feelings. Whichever one was drawn, the two would use it as the topic and compose a poem respectively. Comparing similar poems, it would naturally be easier to distinguish who was better. Of course, everyone had their own style of poetry. In order to eliminate chance and ensure fairness, 3 lots would be drawn for this competition. The moment the young man closed his eyes, Li Yi had already walked to the table and dipped his brush in ink. Under the shocked expressions of the officials and the envoy of the Qi Kingdom, he wrote decisively. So fast. Could it be that he was prepared? That's not possible. The stick was drawn by the third prince of the Qi Kingdom. Before this, no one knew the topic, unless, cough. Lord Zhu, be careful with your words. The officials seemed to have thought of something in their shock. Their expressions became strange. They looked at each other and then returned to normal. When the envoy of the Qi Kingdom saw this, he naturally thought of something. The expression on his face became somewhat uncertain. Only the third prince's expression was indifferent. When he had drawn the lots, he had already checked them carefully. Every single lot had a different content written on it. Unless he had prepared dozens of excellent poems that could surpass Zhao Xuan's within a day, but that was simply impossible. At this time, he did not care about the poems. He was thinking about something else. His gaze on Li Yi became deeper. After a while, Li Yi put down his brush. Immediately, a eunuch came forward and posted the poem he had written on the paper. At this time, Zhao Xuan of the Qi Kingdom had not opened his eyes. The officials naturally looked over at him. They were first shocked by the elegant semi-cursive script. It was said that the county magistrate of Chang and had great attainments in calligraphy at such a young age. At this moment, they realized that the rumors were true. It must be said that at this moment, a glimmer of hope was ignited in the hearts of the officials. Then, when they read the poem, their hope was mercilessly extinguished again. It's not easy to reach such a level in such a short time. It's also an excellent piece of work. But it's a pity. Among the hundreds of officials in the imperial court, aside from the military generals, those who could be called civil officials were all outstanding individuals. Even if they weren't like Wei Sai, who had spent his entire life studying poetry, how could they not have profound attainments in poetry? Not to mention that they had prepared in advance. If they had really improvised on the spot, it was rare to be able to write such a poem in such a short time. At least, most of them could not do it. But the person in front of him had the title of the best poet in a millennium. If it was only to this extent, it was impossible for him to beat him. Looking at the official size, Jing Emperor's expression did not change. After glancing at Li Yi, he found that he was talking to Yong Ning in a low voice. He felt more at ease. At this moment, Zhao Xuan finally opened his eyes. He walked to his table, picked up his brush, and dipped it in ink. The officials' hearts also twisted. He looked up at the poem that had been posted. His eyes lit up because of the handwriting. Then he shook his head and lowered his head to write. After a moment, Zhao Xiuwen looked up again. This time, the brush in his hand could no longer fall. Chapter 467. What's going on? Why isn't he moving? Maybe he hasn't thought it through. After seeing the poem written by Li Yi in such a short time, the officials felt hopeless. Seeing Zhao Xiuwen staring at the poem for a long time, they were confused. This was not a difficult topic. If Li Xianzi couldn't think of a line of the poem after he finished writing, the officials would doubt whether the title of "The Best Poet in 1,000 Years" was just an empty title. But if that was the case, why would Wang Zhong, the poetry demon, say that he was ashamed of his inferiority? Is there something wrong with Li Xianzi's poem? Someone asked confusedly, noticing that Zhao Xiuwen's eyes were fixed on Li Yi's poem. How can this be? Wei Sai stood in the crowd, his face full of disbelief. Like Zhao Xiuwen, he stared at the poem and murmured, "How can this be? How can this be?" A scholar from the Hongwen school walked out and stroked his beard. He had a slightly excited expression on his face. What an eye-opener. It really is an eye-opener. The officials were very surprised to hear this. This poem could not be said to be ordinary, but it was not outstanding either. But looking at the expressions of Wei Sai and Grand Scholar Chu, it seemed that there was something special about it. So the officials looked at the poem again, left and right, horizontally and vertically, but still couldn't figure it out. The expressions of the people changed. Could it be that Wei Sai, Grand Secretary Chu, and Li Xianzi's attainments in poetry had reached an unfathomable level that they couldn't even understand? At this time, Zhao Xiuwen finally looked away. He put down his brush and walked back to the side of the third prince of the Qi kingdom. He said calmly, "I lost the first round." Hearing this, a eunuch immediately extinguished a long stick of incense. Of course, there was no time limit for this competition. Otherwise, the emperor and the officials wouldn't be able to wait for half a month to compose a poem. From the time they decided on the topic to the time they finished writing the 3 poems, it took them half an hour. Li Xianzi didn't think at all and started writing, so he didn't waste much time. On the other hand, Zhao Xiuwen's incense had been burning for a short while. What? Why? You clearly haven't written it yet. Hearing Zhao Xiuwen's words, the expressions of the envoys of the Qi kingdom changed drastically. After the young man from the Jing kingdom had composed that poem, they had thought that victory was in their grasp. Who would have thought that such a thing would happen? Zhao Xiuwen actually admitted defeat. In an instant, the few envoys looked at him with vigilance. Could it be that this person with the surname Zhao had been bribed by Jinghua? Or could it be that he was Jinghua's spy? In this round, the envoy of the Qi kingdom had lost in a baffling manner. The officials of the Jing kingdom had also won in a daze. He won just like that. Why? Even they had come up with a poem that could surpass Li Xianzi's. Although it took them a little longer to come up with a poem that could surpass Li Xianzi's, it didn't matter if they won another round. Why did this man from the Qi kingdom admit defeat? Was his poem really just a boast? Don't waste too much time in the first round. You did well. The third prince of the Qi kingdom finally withdrew his gaze and patted Zhao Xiuwen's shoulder as he spoke. Zhao Xiuwen nodded. When he looked at the figure chatting and laughing with the young girl again, his expression finally became serious. First round, Li Xianzi wins. The Qi kingdom admitted defeat, so they didn't even need to judge this round. The eunuch immediately announced the result in a loud voice. Even when they heard the news that they had won, the officials still didn't understand why they had won. Wei Sai, what's going on? Yes, great scholar Chu. What's so special about this poem? Why don't you tell us? Though they had won, the officials felt even more tormented. Wei Sai and Great Scholar Chu immediately became the focus of attention. Great Scholar Chu stroked his beard again and said with a smile, "My lords, please take a look at Li Xianzi's poem again." The crowd felt puzzled and looked at the poem again. The tide follows the dark waves of the snowy mountain and the distant fishing boat catches the moonlight. The bridge faces the gate of the temple and the path is small. The alley is the spring and the stone ripples are clear. The distant green trees and the river are at dawn. The rosy sunset is clear. Looking at the clouds and water in the distance, the thousands of dots on the blue peak are light. But no matter how they looked at it, this poem, writing about the cold mountain temple, didn't seem to have anything special. This poem could barely describe the scene at dusk. If they thought about it carefully, it would be suspected of going off topic. "Master Chu, don't keep us guessing," an official urged. Great Scholar Chu shook his head and said, "My lords, why don't you try to read this poem backwards?" Read backwards. The officials were puzzled. How could a poem be read backwards? But an official read it out reflexively. The thousands of dots on the blue peak are light, the water is the edge of the clouds and the water is the edge of the clouds and the stone ripples are clear. Hiss, this, he closed his mouth after reading one line, and his eyes seemed to pop out from his eye sockets. How can it be? How can it be done like this? This poem is actually a poem if you read it backwards. After being reminded by Great Scholar Chu, the officials had finally figured out the secret. The tide follows the dark waves of the snowy mountain and the distant fishing boat catches the moonlight. The bridge faces the gate of the temple and the path is small. The alley is the spring and the stone ripples are clear. The distant green trees and the river is at dawn. The rosy sunset is clear. The distant green trees and the water is the edge of the clouds and the stone ripples are clear. The thousands of dots on the blue peak are light, the water is the edge of the clouds and the stone ripples are clear. The clear sunset is red, the trees are the edge of the clouds and the stone ripples are clear. The alley is the spring and the stone ripples are clear. The small path faces the bridge of the Pine Gate Temple. The fishing boat under the bright moon is far away. The snowy waves follow the tide in the dark. This poem was an excellent poem regardless of whether it was read forward or backward. When the two were combined, the meaning was naturally different. Not only could it be read forward, but it could also be read backward. Moreover, it was still neat and appropriate. It could be seen that Li Xianzi's writing skills had reached the pinnacle in terms of choosing words and constructing sentences. If it was read forward, it could be said that it was the moonlit night scene and the river was at dawn. If it was read backward, it could be said that it was read from dawn to the fishing boat singing in the evening. The crowd could even imagine the two scenes at the cold mountain temple outside the city. Could a poem be written this way? They finally understood what Great Scholar Chu meant when he said it was an eye-opener. They had lived for dozens of years, and this was the first time they had seen such a marvelous poem. It was no wonder that Zhao Xuan gave up after taking a look at it. Even if he was given 10 or 100 incense sticks, he might not be able to do it, let alone one incense stick. At this moment, the officials looked at Li Yi in a different way. He could write such a poem that had never been seen before. Even if he had prepared beforehand, how bad could his poetic talent be? Perhaps, they really had a chance of winning today's contest. Chapter 468. Su Shi's Jinshan Temple was a masterpiece among palindromic poems. Although it was not as well known as most of his poems, it still had a high status in the professional field. The development of poetry in this world was far inferior to that of the world Li Yi was familiar with. Because of the uniqueness of this poem, the shock it caused was even greater than those top works. It did not express emotion or ambition. It was purely to show off. Bite me if you don't like it. Zhao Xiuwen saw this, so he simply admitted defeat to avoid wasting time. Of course, he could write a poem that did not lose to it, but to write a poem that could be read vertically and vertically, with a good artistic conception, was not something that could be completed in a short period of time. In fact, he was not even sure if he could write it. If this poem really came from the young man in front of him, then his mastery of words must have reached a terrifying level. Jing Di's expression was calm. He sat on the dragon throne and gave people a feeling that everything was under his control. The officials were relieved. The emperor was indeed the emperor. It turned out that he had a plan to replace Wei Sai at the last minute. The third prince of the Qi kingdom patted Zhao Xiuwen's shoulder and comforted him. I did not expect Li Xianzi to have such profound attainments in poetry at such a young age. Just try your best. There is no need to worry too much about winning or losing. I am very happy to have met an interesting opponent. Zhao Xiuwen smiled as if he did not care at all. At this time, the two eunuchs had already lit their incense sticks. The third prince of the Qi kingdom had drawn the first stick. The second one was naturally the Jing kingdoms. Prime Minister Shen casually drew a stick from the bamboo tube. After glancing at it, he looked at the two and said, "Duanwu." It was not difficult to write poems about festivals. Every year, there would be countless of them. But because they were so common, it was especially difficult to stand out from them. The atmosphere in the hall was quiet. The officials held their breath and tried not to make a sound. Zhao Xiuwen closed his eyes again. The officials in the court had already investigated him. When he wrote poems, he liked to close his eyes and meditate. When he opened his eyes, it was the time when the poem was completed. Because it was too quiet in the hall, the sudden footsteps were especially clear. When the crowd saw Li Xianzi walk to the table and start writing, their expressions froze again. From the time Prime Minister Shen announced the topic to the time he walked to the table, it was only a few breaths of time. In such a short time, he actually thought of a poem. No matter how high his attainments in poetry were, it was impossible for him not to think. All the officials had strange expressions on their faces and sighed inwardly. Even if His Majesty really had made arrangements, this county magistrate should have acted more realistically. With such poor acting skills, he couldn't even fool them, let alone the people of the Qi kingdom. His Majesty really found the wrong person this time. Which of the officials couldn't act better than County Magistrate Li? Under everyone's gaze, Li put down his brush and said in his heart, "Mr. Dongpa, I'll borrow your poem again." "I hope you won't mind." The eunuch immediately hung up the paper, the ink still wet. This time, when the officials looked over, their expressions were completely different from before. Different from the previous poem, this one didn't deliberately show off. Whether it was the content or the form, it was recognized by countless people as the mainstream. Guanxi Sha, Duanwu. Light sweat slightly penetrates the blue wan, Ming Dynasty Duanwu baths fragrant orchids. Fragrant blossoms fill the clear river. Colorful threads gently wrap around the red jade arm, small talismans hang diagonally from the green cloud. Beautiful people meet for 1,000 years. The few lines of the poem not only vividly displayed the folk customs of the Duanwu festival, but the last line was the finishing touch. Beautiful people meet for 1,000 years. This was probably the longest and truest promise, right? He just didn't know who this beauty was. Could she be his wife? No one knew when Zhao Xiuwen had opened his eyes, but he didn't immediately start writing. Instead, he walked over to Li Yi, cupped his hands, and asked, "I am Zhao Xiuwen. May I know your name?" All the officials were surprised. At this moment, Zhao Xiuwen didn't write a poem, but came over to get close to Li Yi. Li Yi. Li Yi cupped his hands. He thought to himself, "Hurry up and write. Once you're done, we can end this boring competition. If this goes on, Master Dongpa's coffin won't be able to hold on any longer." As expected, Li Xianzi, Li Yi. I should have known. Zhao Xuan didn't look surprised at all. He sighed and took out a thin book from his sleeve. He said, I originally thought that among the younger generation, no one could compare to me in poetry. It wasn't until I passed Beijing and Prefecture and bought this Mingyu collection that I realized how foolish I was. Ever since then, I have often read Brother Li's poems and my emotions have been stirred up. I can't sleep at night. I think a true immortal of poetry is nothing more than this. I've always wanted to be friends with Brother Li, but I've never been able to do so. I didn't think I'd meet you at such an occasion. Fate really does make fools of people. Zhao Xuan's words left all the officials speechless. Even though Zhao Xuan was from Qi, all the officials recognized his poetic talent. He had defeated Wang Zhong, the poetry demon. Many scholars of the Jing kingdom had been defeated by him. But such a person had described himself as a frog in a well. How much praise was this for Li Xianzi? Every word he said was praising Li Xianzi and was not stingy with his choice of words. The meaning behind his words was that he had admitted defeat in this competition. In this case, the Jing kingdom had lost one round and won another. Although it was a draw, it had given them a chance to catch their breath. This was extremely important. I'm not as good as you, Zhao Xuan said seriously as he looked at Li Yi. The Qi kingdom's ambassadors' faces darkened. One of them was about to speak, but the third prince glared at him and he swallowed his words. Li Yi was also surprised. Zhao Xuan had said such words in front of the Qi kingdom's ambassadors and the officials of the Jing kingdom. This was beyond his expectations. Had he met a fan? He had to admit that regardless of whether it was the third prince of the Qi kingdom or the person in front of him, even if they were from different camps, it was difficult for him to feel any ill will towards them. Thank you for letting me win. Li Yi cupped his hands again. The Qi kingdom's third prince nodded his head at Li Yi. Then he lifted his head and said, Your Majesty, we have lost this competition. From the beginning to the end, he had not asked a single question of Zhao Xuan. As the Qi kingdom's third prince's words fell, there was an immediate uproar in the court. No one had expected that this competition of poetry would have such an outcome. There was no judgment, no debate. Li Xianzi was direct and efficient. Zhao Xuan had admitted defeat twice and won so easily. At a time when the people of the Jing kingdom were in low spirits, this victory was undoubtedly an uplifting event. The imperial court's reputation had been restored. Not long after, the officials walked out of the main hall. At the same time, news spread from the palace gates. Chapter 469. Li Yi, the Prince of Chang and County, had always been a special figure in the imperial court. He was highly favored by the emperor. He was skilled in mathematics, Buddhism, and medicine. The divine punishment that he offered caused the Jing kingdom to no longer be weak in terms of military strength. When faced with the powerful Qi kingdom, they also had the ability to fight back. But at the same time, he was the first to beat a prince in the imperial palace in front of all the officials, disregarding the rules of etiquette. All along, the officials in the imperial court had different opinions about him. But this time, even the officials who were close to the king of Shu had to praise him sincerely. Well done. Because the significance of this contest had already surpassed the contest itself. After several defeats, the prestige of the imperial court among the people had dropped significantly. If the imperial court were to lose 2 battles in a row in this kind of competition between countries, it was likely that the people of the world would be utterly disappointed in the emperor and the imperial court. This was also the objective that the people of Qi Kingdom wanted to achieve. Now, Li Xianzi had slapped away their conspiracy with a resounding slap. Weren't the people of the Qi Kingdom good at writing poems? Now, even he admitted that he was far inferior to Li Xianzi. When he left, he even shamelessly asked the emperor for one of Li Xianzi's original poems. Who would dare to say that the Jing kingdom was weak in the future? Outside the imperial palace, many people had been waiting in the distance since dawn. There were old and young people, men and women, but most of them were young. Confucian scholars made up the majority. There were students from the capital, and there were also people who had come from the neighboring counties. This was because what was going on in the imperial palace today was not only a competition between two people, but also a competition between countries. It was closely related to each and every one of them. They had lost a contest yesterday, so today's contest was particularly important. Most of them looked solemn and didn't talk. Occasionally, they glanced in the direction of the gate of the palace. After the contest, the news would definitely pass through here, so they would be the first to know. They didn't know how long they had waited. At a certain moment, a heavy sound finally came from the front. The guards at the gate of the palace opened the gate, and all the officials came out. They were in groups of 3 to 5, talking and laughing. They looked very relaxed. When the people who were waiting nearby saw this scene, they were slightly startled. Then, as if they realized something, a trace of joy quickly appeared on their faces. Not long after, a few fast horses galloped out from the edge of the crowd. The news that the Jing kingdom won the second round of the competition spread in all directions. How did the two of you get to know the third prince of the Qi kingdom? Mingzu asked as she looked at Li Yi and Li Xian without moving her chopsticks. Li Xian was a little depressed and said, "How would we know that the guy we met in the Jadeite courtyard was the third prince of the Qi kingdom? I thought he was a nice guy." Princess Shaning took a big bite of rice. She raised her head and a grain of rice stuck to the corner of her mouth. She asked curiously, "What kind of place is Jade Courtyard? Is it fun? Take me with you next time." Prince Jin, Li Han, didn't care about this. It was not easy to get a chance to eat with them. If he didn't seize the time to eat more, he didn't know when he would have the chance to eat again. Li Yi remembered that he had said to Rui that he would go back for dinner in the morning. It seemed that he would have to wait until the afternoon. He put some food in little Yongning's bowl and looked at Mingzu and said, "That's the third prince of the Qi kingdom. Why did he come to the capital?" Mingzu shook her head and said, "Although the third prince of the Qi kingdom is the third prince, he is the most capable one among all the princes of the Qi kingdom. He is deeply trusted by the king of the Qi kingdom and has a high prestige in the hearts of the people of the Qi kingdom. The series of things against the Jing kingdom should be planned by him." Li Yi nodded. The third prince of the Qi kingdom did have his outstanding points. He came to the Jing kingdom with a few people with the envoy group of the Qi kingdom and forced the old emperor and all the officials in the court step by step. It was enough for him to boast for the rest of his life when he went back. Not to mention other things, if Li Han hadn't been lazy and read all the contents of the booklet, the old emperor and the officials would have jumped into the big pit they had dug. Thousands of years later, when middle school textbooks talked about the equal ratio of numbers, this would be an interesting example. The name of the old emperor would definitely be more famous than that of the founding emperor of the Jing kingdom. Of course, the most terrifying thing about the third prince was not this. Obviously, they were enemies, but Li Yi didn't feel much hatred or hostility toward him. Was this the legendary personal charm? If he became the king of the Qi kingdom in the future, the Jing kingdom would be in danger. The king of Shu was an idiot who only knew how to hold parties. He couldn't be compared with that young man at all. If this went on, once the old emperor died, the Jing kingdom would not be far from destruction. "County Magistrate Li, His Majesty wants to see you." The reason why Changde wasn't well liked was because he always appeared at the most inopportune time. Li Yi put down his chopsticks, touched Yongning's head, and said, "I'll go out for a while. I'll be back soon." Then he stood up and walked straight outside. Changde had never seen him so straightforward. He was a little stunned for a moment. "Let's go." "What are you waiting for?" Standing outside the door, Li Yi looked back at Changde and urged him. County Magistrate Li seems to be in a hurry this time. Changde's voice was always gloomy. Why do you think His Majesty wants to see me this time? Li Yi asked curiously. Changde said indifferently, how can servants like us know His Majesty's thoughts? A eunuch who didn't know how to figure out His Majesty's thoughts was not a good eunuch. With Changde's intelligence, how did he climb to the position of Chief Chamberlain? Could it be that he got in through the back door? Could it be that His Majesty is so happy that he wants to reward me with something after winning the competition with the people of the Qi Kingdom? I don't want money this time. If I can become a duke, I can consider it. Changde glanced at him and said, stop dreaming. Go in. When Li Yi walked into the hall of diligent government, Emperor Jing was not reading the memorials. Instead, he stood in front of a table and looked at something with interest. All right, there is no one else here. Emperor Jing waved his hand and turned to look at Li Yi. He asked, how did you come up with this poem in such a short time? Li Yi glanced at the table and found that it was the first palindrome poem that he had just copied. The second one had been taken away by Zhao Xuan in front of the officials. Li Yi thought in his heart that great layperson Su's coffin must be suppressed. He said, Your Majesty, I don't know why, but when I saw the title, this poem suddenly appeared in my mind. Emperor Jing was stunned for a moment. He shook his head and said, forget it. Even Zhao Xuan said so. I think I have underestimated you. I promised you that if you can win this competition, I will allow you to take Yongning out of the palace for a month. An emperor does not go back on his words. When this matter with the Qi Kingdom is over, I will fulfill my promise. The old emperor still kept his promise. This was a good deal. As Li Yi was thinking this, he heard Emperor Jing ask again, are you familiar with the scriptures? If you were to go and debate with the great scholar of the Qi Kingdom, how confident would you be? Li Yi was stunned for a moment and shook his head. Your Majesty, you know that I only know a little about poetry. I really don't know anything about the scriptures. Otherwise, I would not still be a scholar. If Prime Minister Qin and so many great scholars could not do it, I would not be able to do it. Jing Di nodded his head. He was just asking casually. It would take at least 10 years to deeply understand the meaning of the scriptures, and if one really wanted to master it thoroughly, one would need to exhaust his entire life's energy. If even the grand scholar of the Hongwen school could not do it, then no one could win. In short, this time, he could not pin his hopes on Li Yi. You can leave first. I let Yongning out of the palace to treat her illness. I will not use this as a condition. When this matter is over, I will reward you. I will take my leave. Li Yi cupped his hands and turned to walk out of the hall. Emperor Jing looked at his back as he left. A thoughtful expression appeared on his face. He suddenly said, 2 months. Li Yi's footsteps stopped. After a moment, he turned his head and asked doubtfully, Your Majesty just said, what scriptures? Chapter 470. The so-called debate of the classics is to use the scriptures as the topic. 2 people ask questions and 1 answers. The questions are all from the Confucian classics, and the person being asked has to explain the meaning within. These classics include but are not limited to the 13 classics. When Prime Minister Qin was young, he was famous in the capital city for his debate of the classics, but he was not as good as the great scholar of the Qi Kingdom. If you want to win, not only do you need to memorize the meaning of these classics, you also need to have your own understanding. Really 2 months? Li Yi asked again with some uncertainty. An emperor does not joke. Jing Emperor nodded with a faint smile. Li Yi touched his nose and pretended to be enlightened. Your Majesty, I suddenly remembered that I seem to know a little about classics. You have to think about it carefully. Those classics are enough to fill half a room. The great scholar of the Qi kingdom has been studying classics all his life. Even the grand scholar of the Hongwen school may not be able to beat him in classics. If you lose, I will not punish you. I will allow you to take Yongning out of the palace. Just pretend that I never said anything. Li Yi secretly despised Jing Emperor. Just now, he said that an emperor does not joke. In the blink of an eye, he wanted to go back on his words. If it were not for his identity, he would have spat at him with contempt. Rest assured, Your Majesty. It happens that I have some confidence in classics. Li Yi looked at Jing Emperor and said with a smile. Jing Emperor's face finally showed a trace of seriousness. Are you serious? 2 months. Your Majesty is also serious. Li Yi said again. Since it was a deal, he had to confirm the chips again and again. Jing Emperor thought for a moment and nodded. Tomorrow morning, I will send someone to pick you up. If you can win for me again, I will raise your title by 1 level. You will become a county uncle at the age of 20. I am afraid that the capital will be shocked. What do you think? I will go back to prepare. The title of nobility was not important. Even if he were to be promoted 1 rank higher, he would only be a county earl. It was far from being comparable to a duke. Li Yi cupped his fists and prepared to leave. After taking 2 steps, he seemed to have thought of something and turned back. What other requests do you have? Jing Di looked at him and asked. I don't have any request. Li Yi's expression was a little puzzled. He looked at Emperor Jing and asked, I just want to ask Your Majesty, what are the 13 scriptures? Was I too hasty this time? Li Yi had been gone for a while. Jing Di rubbed his eyebrows and asked with some doubt. Your Majesty, can you allow this old servant to say something? Changde, who was usually silent in front of Emperor Jing, suddenly said. Emperor Jing waved his hand and said, You don't have to be so polite between us. Changde thought for a while and said, Your Majesty, do you think that County Magistrate Li will agree to something that he has no confidence in? Emperor Jing was stunned for a moment. He shook his head and said, From the moment I began to pay attention to him until now, except for the incident where he beat the king of Shu, which surprised me, he has always been calm in doing things. He would not easily take risks if he was not 100% sure. In that case, Your Majesty doesn't have to worry. Changde said with a smile. Jing Di thought for a while and smiled. He nodded and said, I was thinking too much. Let's see what kind of surprise he will give me, the court officials, and the people of my Jing kingdom tomorrow. When they came back from the Hall of Diligent Government, they left a little of every dish for themselves. Li Yi ate and asked Mingzu, How do I get to Hongwen Building? What are you going to Hongwen Building for? Mingzu asked with her eyebrows raised. Hongwen Building was the National Library. Most of the people in the building were old scholars who managed and corrected books. In her opinion, Li Yi did not look like a person who liked to read. Li Yi glanced at her and said, Your Majesty asked me to debate with great scholar tomorrow. I have to go and see what it is. Mingzhu's beautiful eyes widened. Debate? You? What's wrong with me? Li Yi looked at her discontentedly. Don't look down on me. Who says that the older you are, the more powerful you are? This era belongs to the young people. Don't you understand that the later waves of the Yangtze River beat the waves in front? Mingzu asked with furrowed brows, Are you serious? You have already won the poetry contest, there is no point in trying to show off. Do you think you are better than Prime Minister Qin and Grand Scholar Zhou when it comes to the interpretation of the scriptures? Li Yi snorted, You will know how good I am in the future. Mingzu looked at him, a suspicious expression on her face. It was not his style to debate the interpretation of the scriptures with great scholar sect for no reason. She looked at Li Yi and asked, What benefit did my father give you? Li Yi put down his chopsticks and sighed. He looked at her and said earnestly, "What benefits can there be? As a citizen of the Jing kingdom, you must always take the rejuvenation of the country as your responsibility. How can you disregard the honor and disgrace of the country? You must be able to stand up for the country at critical moments. Even if you have to sacrifice yourself, you will not hesitate." "Did my father agree to promote you to a higher official rank?" Mingsu asked again. "Not a higher official rank, just a title." The Hongwen building was the place where the officials of the imperial court retired, so it had always been a leisurely place. Besides a few old scholars, there were only some servants who did the chores here. Once in a while, some young officials who were disliked would be transferred here. Soon after, they would either resign or find a way to be transferred to another place. It was evident how boring it was to work here. The Hongwen building was not as peaceful as it used to be today. The scholars were baffled as they looked at the young man walking around in the building from a distance. He didn't even read the books but merely touched the bookshelves casually. What's wrong with Li Xianzi? Why did he come to our Hongwen building? Why is the princess by his side? What is he doing there? The books are all the scriptures. If he is reading the books, why don't I see him reading them? Is it possible that he can memorize all the contents of the books by touching them casually? I'm not sure. It's said that this Li Xianzi suffers from some kind of hysteria. It looks like the rumor is true. We shouldn't provoke him, otherwise, thinking of the miserable fate of the king of Shu, the scholars immediately retreated more than 10 steps. What are you doing? Mingsu, who was standing beside Li Yi, couldn't help but ask, "What are you doing? You don't understand. The competition is tomorrow, so I need to familiarize myself with it today." As Li Yi spoke, he picked up another book. At the same time, a book appeared out of thin air on the bookshelf in his mind. Li Yi put down the book and picked up another one. Familiarize, familiarize. Li Mingzhu looked at him and shook her head helplessly. No matter when or where, he always did things out of the blue, and no one could guess what he was thinking. However, looking at his appearance, it seemed that he was already confident of winning the competition tomorrow. Mingsu shook her head and didn't think too much about it. Thinking that he wouldn't finish in a short while, she simply walked out of the hall and waited. The Hongwen building was unusually quiet. Only a few footsteps could be heard from time to time. However, outside the imperial palace, the people in the capital city were already boiling because of a certain piece of news. Li Xianzi had defeated the Qi kingdom in the poetry competition today and won back some ground for the Jing kingdom, which made the people in the capital city heave a sigh of relief. The 2 poems he composed in the Golden Hall had already been posted. When the palindrome poems, which could be read vertically and backwards, were published, it not only blinded the eyes of countless people, but also made countless scholars exclaim in admiration. It turned out that poems could be composed in this way. In addition, some gossip that people took delight in came out from various brothels in the capital city. For example, Zhao Xiuwen of the kingdom of Qi, who was known as the best poet in 1,000 years, did not even manage to compose a poem today. The moment he saw Li Xianzi's poem, he immediately admitted defeat and admitted that he was ashamed of his inferiority. He even asked for Li Xianzi's poem manuscript back. Of course, some people also revealed that Zhao Xiuwen was actually one of the admirers of Li Xianzi's poems. He carried Li Xianzi's poetry collection with him and could only fall asleep after reading Li Xianzi's poems several times at night. For the people in the capital city, what could be more satisfying than winning today's competition? Of course there was. That was, they not only had to win, but they had to win beautifully. They had to win so that the people of the Qi kingdom would be convinced. And Li Xianzi had achieved this. On this day, the haze and worry on the faces of the people in the capital city was swept away. There was no longer any depression in their hearts. On this day, the brothels in the capital city were almost full. Scholars recited poems and tried their best to release their passion. On this day, countless girls in the boudoir were holding a copy of the collection of the bright moon. They copied the latest poem, the Duanmu of the Huanxi Sha, and their faces were flushed as they recited the words, "Beauty meets for 1,000 years." On this day, Li Yi, the county magistrate of Chang'an, became famous in the capital city. Chapter 471. Are you still there? In the backyard of the Jade's courtyard, Fong was squatting on a stone. He hadn't heard any sound for a long time, so he asked. After a while, he heard light footsteps again. The girl said apologetically, "I don't know what happened today, but there are a lot of guests in the courtyard. I'm very busy, so I can't talk to you here." Fong smiled and said, "It's okay, you can go. I have to go back. Then tomorrow. I'll wait for you here tomorrow." The girl said quickly, and the footsteps gradually went away. Fong stood up, patted the dirt on his butt, and went back to the street. When he passed by the butcher's shop, he remembered that his wife liked to eat high-quality pork belly. She had been talking about it for several days. He walked to the front of the shop and asked the butcher, "Is this meat fresh?" The butcher was also a man with a fierce face. He patted his chest and said, "Customer, don't worry. This meat was just killed this morning. It can't be any fresher." Fong nodded, "Give me 3 caddies of pork belly." "Okay." The butcher grunted in acknowledgement. He used a boning knife to cut the meat a couple of times, and then wrapped the meat with a lotus leaf and tied a rope. He said with a smile, 3 caddies 6 taels. "Dear customer, please take it. I'll take a small change and count it as a silver coin." Naturally, old Fong was not short of money. In fact, although it was difficult to buy a big house in the capital, he had saved a lot of money during this period of time. He could marry 10 wives and still have a lot of money left. He could be considered a wealthy family. However, when he touched his waist, he realized that he had left in a hurry this morning and did not bring a single coin with him. The butcher saw this and guessed that he didn't bring money. He smiled and said, "Customer, did you forget to bring money? It's okay. You can take the meat first. You can pay for it next time." Fong smiled and asked, "Aren't you afraid that I'll go back on my words?" The butcher laughed and said, "That won't do. You come here every day, and I don't think you're that kind of person. Besides, I'm in a good mood today. If you really want to renege on your debt, I'll give this meat to you. You're just a butcher. What's there to be happy about? Is your wife pregnant?" Old Fong took the meat and didn't refuse. He casually asked, "Alas, I still haven't gotten my wife." The butcher sighed, and then thought of something else. Suddenly, a smile appeared on his face, and he said, "But if you want to talk about this happy event, the whole capital is talking about it, and you don't even know about it. I'll have to tell you about it. Moreover, the people of the Qi Kingdom are extremely arrogant. They've been looking for trouble everywhere in the capital city. This time, they've even gone so far as to cause a ruckus in the imperial court." A moment later, Fong was shocked. "Isn't Li Xianzi referring to my son-in-law? In the morning, I saw my son-in-law go to the imperial palace, but I didn't expect him to do such a big thing. Even the butcher on the street knows about my son-in-law's deeds." After taking the meat and leaving, Fong didn't go home directly. There was a brothel nearby, and he planned to borrow some money from an acquaintance to pay for the meat. "Master, please slow down." Outside a brothel somewhere in the capital city, a pale-faced, frail middle-aged man was supported by a servant into the brothel. "Master, let's go back. Those people, those people." The servant opened his mouth with a troubled expression, but was interrupted by the middle-aged man with a wave of his hand. "Don't worry. I can still bear this little curse." The middle-aged man's voice was a little hoarse, but his tone was unusually firm. Behind them, a man carrying meat walked into the brothel. He looked back and said, "Your body is so weak. Why did you come to the brothel instead of resting at home?" The servant in green was about to say something, but the man turned around and left after saying that. The master and the servant walked into the brothel and found a secluded place to sit down. As soon as they sat down, they heard several people talking around them. "This Li Xianzi has really made our Jing kingdom proud. Yes, this time, let's see how arrogant the people of the Qi kingdom can be. Say, if Deputy Ma won yesterday, we won't have to play anymore. It's all that Ma Gai's fault. He's not good at chess, but he insisted on being a hero." Hearing these comments, the servant in green was indignant. The middle-aged man's face was a little gloomy, but he didn't say anything. At this moment, there was a sudden uproar in the crowd. The master and the servant looked up and saw an old man sitting on the table in front of them. "Hey, old Jing, let's not talk about anything else today. Tell us how Li Xianzi won against the people of the Qi kingdom." Yes, that's it. The storytellers in the brothel not only told stories, but also talked about current affairs and court politics. After all, people in Jianghu and among the common people were all the people of the Jing kingdom, so they also had to care about the affairs of the court. In addition to gossip, there were many things that were closely related to them. The old man on the table smiled and pressed his hand down. Immediately, the noise below disappeared. Then he said, "I believe everyone is very interested in the story of Li Xianzi's victory against the people of the Qi kingdom. Naturally, I'd like to talk about it. But before that, I'd like to talk about the match yesterday." The pale-faced middle-aged man raised his head slightly. After a moment of silence, the audience immediately became noisy. "A loss is a loss. There's nothing to say. Just talk about Li Xianzi. Why did you mention that Ma Gai? That's right. Tell us about the match this morning." "We can't wait." The middle-aged man involuntarily clenched his fists and his face became even paler. The old man on the table raised his hand again to stop the crowd. He said, "Of course, we have to talk about the incident of Li Xianzi. But there's a hidden story about yesterday's incident. Lord Ma was wronged for no reason and was reviled by the people of the capital city. I won't be happy if I don't talk about it." Hearing this, the servant in green was stunned. The middle-aged man suddenly raised his head and looked at the old man on the table. "Hidden story." Hearing this, the crowd was also surprised. Obviously, it was the first time they had heard of it. What hidden story? Did the people of the Qi kingdom play tricks in yesterday's match? Tell us. Amidst the urging of the crowd, the old man slowly said, "Everyone thinks that Deputy Ma lost to the nameless old man of the Qi kingdom, but they don't know that the nameless old man is known as the chess soul. He's the true #1 chess player of the Qi kingdom. This time, he hid his name to deal a heavy blow to the morale of the Jing kingdom. Even the chess saint, Bai Yu, was defeated by him. Who else could win? But since the people of the Qi kingdom have issued a challenge, if no one steps forward, doesn't it mean that the Jing kingdom has no one capable? Deputy Ma knew that he might not be able to win, but he still stepped forward at this time. Doesn't he know what kind of infamy he'll have to bear if he loses? But he still stepped forward. Because if even he cowers at the back, there's really no hope of winning this match. It's not terrible to lose. We'll win it back eventually. But if no one in the entire capital city takes up the challenge, how will the people of the Qi kingdom mock our Jing kingdom?" The old man spoke with fervor and assurance. The brothel was extremely quiet. The green-clothed servant's face was filled with joy. The middle-aged man's face was abnormally rosy, and his hands were trembling slightly. Everyone's expressions changed from doubt to astonishment, and then to anger. Many of them even had expressions of deep shame on their faces. What? Is that true? That old man is actually so powerful. Pfft, I thought he was just an ordinary old man. Yeah, if no one steps forward, I'm afraid we'll be even more ridiculed. We've wronged Deputy Ma. Damn it, the people of the Qi Kingdom are so shameless. If that's the case, Deputy Ma. Sigh, I shouldn't have scolded him. No one doubted the authenticity of the old man's words. After all, although the brothel had opened not long ago, not only did it have exciting stories and plays, it had never made a big fuss about important matters. It was unlike other brothels that relied on making money by flaunting all kinds of untrue information. It could be considered a brothel with a conscience. After that, thinking about how they had scolded Deputy Ma for the past 2 days, the crowd naturally felt apologetic towards him. When this matter began to spread throughout the capital city, the crowd also learned of the truth of this matter through countless channels. The people of the capital city gathered in groups in front of the Ma mansion to apologize. The winds in the streets changed abruptly. Within a day, Deputy Ma turned from a national sinner to a national hero. The legendary story of Deputy Ma's fearless attitude towards power and admonishing the people to death was also widely spread in various brothels. Countless young imperial censors began to view Deputy Ma as their life idol. Of course, this was all a story for another time. At this moment, on a spacious street somewhere in the capital city, a middle-aged man's face was flushed with excitement. He rejected the servant support and listened to the idle chatter of a few people on the street. The smile on his face grew wider. Justice is in the hearts of the people. What a good justice is in the hearts of the people. Recalling the words of the old man in the brothel, the middle-aged man stroked his chest and laughed heartily. Even the lowly actors are worried about the suffering of the country. The imperial censors in the court should often come to these places. This way, they can absorb the public's opinion. As the imperial censor muttered these things in a low voice, in a brothel, a few storytellers sat on 2 sides of a long table. At the head of the table, Old Sun slowly said, "Storytelling is not only about telling stories. We need to live up to our conscience. We can't follow the crowd and be influenced by rumors. The more it is at this time, the more we need to spread the truth. This way, we can gain the trust of the customers. Your Highness, I don't know why, but within half a day, the winds in the marketplace have suddenly changed. I'm afraid our plan will have to be put on hold." In a luxurious courtyard in the capital city, a middle-aged man in a blue robe spoke respectfully to a young man standing in a pavilion with his hands behind his back. "It's fine. That matter was just a chess piece I made in my spare time. I don't know when it will be used. If it fails, then it fails. It doesn't matter." The handsome young man turned his head and sighed. "However, I have to admit that they have greatly exceeded I's expectations. This is indeed the capital city of the Jing Kingdom. The wisdom of its people is far beyond that of other places." A look of regret appeared on the middle-aged man's face. At this moment, the young man spoke again. "How is the investigation on that matter going?" The middle-aged man's face turned solemn. "Your Highness, everything has been investigated. That Chang and county magistrate, Li Yi, is the one who created Tianfa. He is also the person that the young prince of the Jing Kingdom mentioned. First, Tianfa caught us off guard and caused us to lose 2 cities. The general who supports the state almost died in front of His Majesty as an apology. Today, he defeated Zhao Xiuwen, causing our plan to be put on hold. This Li Yi is the bane of the Qi Kingdom. It was undoubtedly difficult for the people of Qi to obtain information in the capital city of the Jing Kingdom. However, seeing that the 3rd prince valued that person, the middle-aged man even used a spy that had not been used in the capital city of the Jing Kingdom for many years. At this moment, he revealed everything he knew. The young man nodded and said, "I originally thought that he had only created Tianfa. I didn't expect that this Li Yi would be so talented. No wonder Emperor Jing values him so much." A cold light flashed across the middle-aged man's face. In a low voice, he said, "Your Highness, with this person around, he will always be a great threat to us. Should we?" The third prince of the Qi kingdom waved his hand and said, "Don't always think of solving problems in this way. Even Xiuan has praised him. I have never seen him praise someone so much in poetry. Tianfa has also caused us great trouble. Poetry, writing, medical skills, Tianfa, such a genius, why was he not born in the Qi kingdom? You just said that he has enmity with the eldest grandson of Prime Minister Qin of the Jing kingdom and the king of Shu." The third prince of the Qi kingdom looked at him and suddenly asked. The middle-aged man nodded and said, "Yes, this Li Yi has deep enmity with the eldest grandson of Marquis Qin and the king of Shu. Just a few days ago, in the imperial palace, he beat the king of Shu into a coma in front of all the civil and military officials. However, the strange thing is that Emperor Jing only grounded him for half a month and didn't punish him too much." The third prince of the Qi kingdom smiled and said, "If I were Emperor Jing, I wouldn't punish him too heavily." He walked out of the pavilion and paced slowly in the courtyard as he murmured, "Although the king of Shu has no talent, he is the one who is most likely to inherit the throne among all the princes. Obviously, he can't let go of this enmity easily. Prime Minister Qin is a powerful person and wholeheartedly supports the king of Shu to ascend the throne. In the future, the Qin family will become the backbone of the new dynasty. At that time, Li Yi's position in the imperial court will be somewhat subtle. However, this is not necessarily bad news for us." As soon as the young man finished speaking, his face suddenly changed slightly. With a shake of his body, he immediately moved a few feet to the side. Whoosh! 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 At the place where he had been standing, 3 arrows were deeply inserted into the soil. The middle-aged man's face changed greatly. He immediately stood in front of the young man and shouted, "Protect the third prince." Several figures suddenly appeared in the courtyard and surrounded the young man. Then, several people separated and climbed up to the roof with a few leaps. In an instant, they disappeared before their eyes. Not long after, the people who had left jumped over the wall of the courtyard and threw a corpse on the ground. One of them said, "Your Highness, when we rushed over, the man had already committed suicide by taking poison." The middle-aged man said angrily, "Damn the Jing kingdom. How could they do such a despicable thing? Your Highness, I will write a letter to His Majesty now." The young man waved his hand and squatted down. He pulled off the mask of the man in black. After looking at him for a moment, he took out an arrow from the quiver on his back. Seeing the blue light on the tip of the arrow, the middle-aged man's face changed greatly and cold sweat instantly soaked his back. The young man threw the arrow on the ground and clapped his hands. He looked into the distance and murmured, "Brother, are you so afraid of me? You're tuning into the Journey of the Soul YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.